Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Good evening, my name is Albert, and I hope you're doing well. This story happened to me about 2 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. Back then, I was doing some side work to help make ends meet. My main job at the auto parts store didn't pay much, so I'd spend my free time restoring old furniture, buying beat-up pieces, fixing them up, and reselling them for a profit. It was during one of these jobs that everything went sideways. My younger sister needed to start an expensive medical treatment, and money was tight. Any extra cash was welcome. A client showed interest in an antique dresser I'd advertised online. The only catch was that she lived way out in the sticks, a small community past the rural outskirts of Bakersfield, California. But she was paying cash, and paying well. I arranged with a buddy who does deliveries to haul the dresser out there one Saturday afternoon. The delivery went smoothly enough. The problem was getting back. My friend had another commitment and couldn't wait around for me. Not wanting to blow the money I'd just earned on an expensive ride back to town, I made the decision I regret to this day. I decided to walk home. It wasn't an insane distance, maybe 4 or 5 miles. My mistake was not calculating the time properly. By the time I finally reached the dirt road that served as a shortcut, night had already fallen hard. That road is strange. It cuts through what used to be a massive ranch, now just overgrown brush and twisted trees. The air there feels different, thicker, with a heavy smell of wet earth even when it hasn't rained. I was walking at a brisk pace with the light from a cheap flashlight, the kind you buy at any hardware store. The weak yellow beam barely illuminated anything. I tried to focus on the sound of my own footsteps on the ground, but it was impossible not to notice the silence around me, broken only by the constant noise of crickets. And it was there, in the middle of nowhere, that I started to feel like I wasn't alone anymore. You always try to fool yourself, right? I thought it was just my head playing tricks on me, nerves from walking alone in the dark. Maybe an animal in the brush, the wind in the leaves. I told myself to stop being such a coward and pick up the pace, that I'd soon reach the lit part of town. That's when I heard it. It started very low, almost a hum. I stopped walking for a second, trying to figure out if the sound was coming from outside or inside my own head. But it became clearer. It was a melody. A music box tune, you know. Those tinny, slightly off-key metal notes playing slowly. A lullaby that had no business being out there, in the middle of nowhere. At first, I didn't feel scared, just confused. Who would be out here in the middle of nothing with something like that? I thought it might be a trap, someone trying to get my attention to rob me. I aimed my flashlight in the direction the sound seemed to be coming from, sweeping the beam across the tall grass at the edge of the road. The music stopped abruptly, and it was in that exact moment of silence that my flashlight beam found her. Along the side of the road, marking the boundary of the old farmland, there was a barbed wire fence falling apart, with wooden posts that were crooked and rotting. Perched on top of one of those posts was a person. I say perched, but it wasn't quite sitting. She was balanced like a bird on the thin tip of that post, which couldn't have been thicker than my arm. It was the silhouette of a woman, or maybe a girl, with her back to me. She wore a simple dress and was completely motionless. It was impossible for someone to balance that way. Impossible. I froze right there in the middle of the road. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my hand, but I couldn't look away. My brain searched for any explanation, but there was no explanation. There was just that figure standing in a way that shouldn't exist. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at that silhouette. Could have been seconds or minutes. In that moment, there was only the light of my flashlight and that strange figure in the darkness. Then she moved, slowly, unnaturally. Her head began to turn in my direction. Her body stayed facing away from the brush, but her neck kept turning, until her face was completely toward me. The flashlight beam lit up her face, and what I saw, I swear I'll never forget what I saw. It was the face of a girl, maybe 17 or 18 years old. Her skin was too white, an oppressive whiteness, almost the color of wax. But it was the eyes that made my entire body freeze. She had no eyes. In their place were just two perfectly round, black, empty holes. A smile spread across that pale face, a wide smile that didn't reach those dark voids. And then she jumped. It wasn't a jump. She launched herself from the post in my direction, but instead of falling, she floated a couple of feet off the ground. She came straight at me at an impossible speed and whooshed past me. As she passed, I heard laughter, a low, strangled cackle that seemed to come from the depths of her throat. But her mouth, that smile, never moved. It all happened in an instant. My body turned by pure instinct, trying to follow her with the light to see where she'd gone, but there was nothing behind me. The road was empty and dark. The relief lasted a split second, just long enough to feel cold air on the back of my neck, and a smell of dust, of closed places, and of mold. She was behind me. I turned around with my whole body rigid and came face to face with her. We were barely an inch apart. I could see the details now: skin that looked like old paper, thin lips stretched in that unmoving smile, and those black holes that seemed to absorb what little light there was. The laughter continued, the same strangled sound, but her face was motionless like a mask. My gaze dropped in pure panic. Her simple, dark dress ended in nothing. She had no legs, no feet. She was floating in front of me. She raised her right hand slowly. Her fingers were long and pale, and she touched my shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive touch. It was light, almost curious, as if she were confirming that I was real. But the cold of that touch was ice from another world, piercing through my shirt, my skin, and settling directly in my bone. She stared at me for one more second with those voids, and then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she launched herself backward, sinking into the darkness of the brush and disappearing among the trees. The laughter faded away with her until the only sound was the crickets again. I stood there alone again, unable to move a single muscle. My shoulder burned with the cold of her touch. That cold on my shoulder was what woke me from that trance, what brought my body back. It was like an electric shock that filled me with panic. My brain could only form one order, the most basic of all: run. And I ran. I ran like I'd never run in my life, not even as a kid. I didn't dare look back. I just threw myself down that dirt road, stumbling in the potholes, the flashlight beam swinging wildly in my hand. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch and move strangely around me. That's when the noise started in the brush to my right. It wasn't a normal sound. It wasn't a scared animal fleeing from me. It was something heavy, something big, breaking dry branches and crushing the undergrowth with a force that made the ground vibrate slightly. And the most terrifying part, that thing was keeping pace with me. I was running like a madman on the road, and the sound of the thing moving through the thick brush stayed exactly beside me. It was too fast, too agile for the weight it seemed to have. Curiosity is a stupid thing in the middle of desperation. I couldn't stand it. I turned my head for a fraction of a second and aimed the flashlight toward the darkness of the farmland. I saw it for just an instant, but I saw it. It was no longer the woman. It was a thing, a dark, shapeless mass, low and stocky, maybe the size of a wild boar, but it didn't look like any animal I know. It looked like a pile of rotting leaves, branches, and wet earth, all pulsing and moving as if it were one organism. That thing passed through a small clearing between two trees, and its movement wasn't that of an animal. It was a kind of sliding, dragging motion, fast, and in a way that doesn't exist. The panic gave me more strength to run. I ran even faster, feeling the air burn my lungs. Then it started throwing things at me. First a handful of dirt and leaves that hit my back, then a small stone that went buzzing past my head. It was playing with me, hunting me for fun. Above the sound of my own desperate breathing and the breaking branches, I heard the laughter again, the same low, strangled cackle without joy, coming from within the brush, coming from that thing. I no longer felt my legs, just moved them by pure survival instinct. My chest felt like it was going to explode at any moment. But then, far ahead, I saw a light, a weak, yellowish light, a street light. It was the beginning of the asphalt, the beginning of town. It was my only chance. Seeing that small light gave me hope. I gathered the last drop of energy I had and ran for it. The noise in the brush continued for a few more yards, always beside me, with that laughter pushing me forward. When my feet finally touched the uneven asphalt of the first street in the subdivision, the noise stopped. I dared to look back, panting, leaning on my knees. The dirt road was dark and silent. There was no sign of anything or anyone. The laughter had disappeared. It seemed like none of it had really happened. But the cold on my shoulder was still there, a frozen spot on my skin. I don't even know how I got home. I opened the door and my mom, who was in the living room, got a fright. She said I was pale, that I had no color, with wide eyes and shaking from head to toe. I tried to speak, to tell her what had happened, but the sounds wouldn't come out. My throat was closed. In the following days, things only got worse. I completely lost my voice for almost a week, and when it came back wrong. I developed a stutter, something that stuck with me, when I get nervous or try to talk about. About that night, I get tongue-tied. The stutter hits me hard. A neighbor of ours, an elderly lady who's a curandera, came to the house at my mother's request. She did some cleansings, passed a bunch of rue over my body, and said I had caught a very strong fright from some evil thing that crossed my path. Little by little, the raw fear diminished, but it never really disappeared. But the part that really keeps me from sleeping well to this day happened the morning after the encounter. I woke up late, exhausted. I went to the kitchen, and through the window I saw something on the doorstep. My heart jumped in my chest. I gathered courage and went to see what it was. It was one of the handles from the dresser I had delivered. A metal handle shaped like a shell that I had polished and screwed into place myself. It was there on the doormat, scratched and twisted as if it had been violently ripped off. For that to be there meant that the thing had not only followed me, it had gone to the client's house, ripped off the handle, and then brought it to my door. That thing didn't just attack me in the middle of nowhere. It knew who I was, knew where I lived, and left a message, a reminder that the terror hadn't stayed on that road. It had followed me home. I never walk alone at night anymore. And sometimes, when the silence is complete, I think I can still hear, very faintly, the sound of an off-key music box playing in the distance. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. What I'm about to tell you happened several years ago, but to this day I feel a strange vibe when I remember it. There were 4 of us, plus the dog. Me, Matthew, Gabriel, who was the oldest, Samuel, and Bridget. We had this tradition of hitting the road at least twice a year, and camping somewhere completely isolated, far from any city. Gabriel owned a beat-up Nissan pickup that could handle rough terrain, so he ended up being our unofficial guide. The dog was his, a Belgian shepherd named Billy, a very gentle animal who had camped with us other times and was the joy of our group. On this particular trip, we went to a wilderness camping area in a remote corner of the Sierra Nevada mountains in Northern California that a friend of Gabriel's had recommended. It was really a secluded place. We had to drive for almost an hour on a dirt road that seemed to have no end. When we finally got out of the truck, the air was heavy. It had that strong smell of decomposing leaves and wet earth, you know. The place was a small clearing surrounded by very thick woods with ferns that reached our waist height. You could feel the humidity sticking to your skin. It was while we were unloading the backpacks and tents that I noticed the first strange thing. It was Billy. Normally, he'd run off exploring like crazy to mark his territory, but that time he didn't. He wouldn't leave Gabriel's side. He stayed with his tail low, almost between his legs, letting out short, muffled barks in the direction of the woods. He wasn't barking at a specific point, but at the tree line in general, as if the entire forest was a threat. "What's up, buddy?" Gabriel said, giving him a pat on the head. "You smell a coyote or something." We laughed and commented that maybe the dog was just getting used to the new place. You know how it is. You always find a logical explanation for everything. We finished setting up camp and Billy's restlessness ended up taking a backseat. A strange detail we decided to ignore, at least for now. Night fell suddenly, as it always does when you're far from the city. There's no slow twilight, the sky just shuts off and that's it. We lit a campfire. Gabriel opened the thermos with coffee, and Samuel, as always, grabbed his guitar to strum some songs we all knew how to sing badly. The atmosphere was good, relaxed. The only one who didn't chill out was Billy. He stayed lying near the fire, but with his ears alert, attentive to every branch creak that came from the darkness surrounding us. After a few hours of talking, I noticed the flames were getting weak. I said I'd go look for more firewood. During the afternoon, I had gathered a bunch of dry, thick branches and made a neat pile near a tree about 10, maybe 15 steps from our campsite. I remembered the spot perfectly. There was enough to last all night with some to spare. Only when I got to the spot, there was nothing. The ground was clean, really clean, as if I had never stacked a single twig there. I went back to the circle of friends, running my hand over the back of my neck, confused. The first thing I thought, of course, was that it was a prank. "All right, very funny. You can give it back now," I said, looking mainly at Samuel, who was the biggest joker in the group. He stopped playing the guitar and looked at me like he had no idea what I was talking about. "Give back what, dude?" "The firewood, the pile of firewood I left over there," I insisted, pointing toward the tree. "It disappeared." Gabriel got up, serious, and went over there with me, lighting the way with his flashlight. He swept the ground with the beam of light. Nothing. Not even the ground looked disturbed. It was as if my memory of that pile of wood were pure imagination. "Matthew, didn't you leave it somewhere else?" he asked in that calm tone that sometimes irritated me. "I'm sure it was here, Gabriel. I'm not crazy." It was Bridget who cut off the argument, her voice a little lower. "Guys, the fire's going to go out." That settled it. We couldn't stay in total darkness. There was no choice. We were going to have to go into the woods to gather more branches. I felt like a complete idiot, but it was also my responsibility to fix it. Samuel, Bridget, and I volunteered, grabbing our flashlights. Gabriel clipped the leash to Billy's collar. The dog whimpered softly. "Wait, I'm coming with you guys," Gabriel said. So all four of us, with the visibly upset dog, left the safety of the campfire and ventured into the dense darkness of the woods. We hadn't walked even 5 minutes into the woods when the atmosphere changed completely. The weak light from our campfire disappeared behind us, and the darkness seemed to become thicker, as if it had weight. The air got colder, and the sound of crickets and cicadas we'd been hearing from camp simply died. The only noise was our own feet crushing the dry leaves on the ground. At least that's what I thought at first. Gabriel was up front with the most powerful flashlight, sweeping the beam from side to side. Billy walked with his body crouched, glued to Gabriel's leg, so tense he looked like a spring about to snap. I was right behind with Bridget and Samuel bringing up the rear. That's when we heard it, a loud crack, unmistakable sound of a thick branch breaking somewhere to our right. We all stopped at the same instant, frozen. Gabriel turned the flashlight sharply toward the sound, but the circle of light only revealed more trees, more vines, more darkness. "Must be an armadillo or something," Samuel whispered, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. Nobody answered. We kept walking, but now the silence was different. It was a heavy silence, loaded with an attention none of us wanted to have, and the noises continued. They weren't so clear anymore, they were more subtle. A rustling of leaves that didn't match the rhythm of our steps. A soft click very far to the left, almost beyond the reach of hearing. It was the horrible sensation that there was someone else walking with us, staying in a creepy way always at the edge of the darkness, where our light didn't reach. That's when Billy started growling. It wasn't an alert bark. It was a low growl that came from deep in his chest, vibrating in the animal's body. The hair on his back was all bristled, and Gabriel had to hold the leash with both hands because the dog was pulling, wanting to advance toward the blackness. We were already gathering some fallen branches, each of us with a clumsy bundle in our arms, when Bridget grabbed my elbow with a force that scared me. Her hand was ice cold. "Matthew," she whispered, and her voice barely came out. "There's someone standing there." My whole body prickled, but I tried to stay calm. "Where, Bridget?" "There," she pointed with her chin. "Behind that wider tree, just watching us." Samuel, who was closer, aimed his handheld flashlight toward where she indicated. The strong, white light bathed the tree trunk, the ferns around it, the dark earth. There was absolutely no one there. "There's nothing there, Bridget." "You're nervous," Samuel said, but his voice also faltered a little at the end. We continued for a few more yards. The atmosphere was now terrible. Nobody was talking anymore. We just wanted to grab the minimum firewood to not spend the night in darkness and get out of there. That's when Samuel himself suddenly stopped, making me crash into his back. "Holy shit," he gasped. "I saw him. I swear I saw him. There was a silhouette there between those two trunks." Gabriel, already out of patience, turned the main flashlight toward the indicated spot. And again, the powerful light found only the empty and indifferent woods. I was the only one who hadn't seen anything. To my eyes, it was just the normal darkness of a forest at night. But my two friends were terrified, and the dog was acting like we were face to face with a predator. I tried to cling to logic, to tiredness, to the suggestion of fear. But a cold doubt was already starting to appear in my head. Something was very wrong. I don't know what got into me. Maybe it was a stupid attempt to act brave, or maybe I just wanted to end that situation as quickly as possible. I was scared, sure, but I think my stubbornness was greater. I gathered all the firewood I could carry in my arms and spoke with a firmness I didn't feel. "Enough. We have enough. Let's go back." I made the effort to go up front, as if I wanted to prove a point. Complete stupidity, I know that today. Gabriel and Billy came right behind me, then Bridget and Samuel practically walking glued to each other. We walked maybe 20 yards. Billy's low growling had transformed into a thin, agonizing whine. And it was at that moment that I saw it. It wasn't like the others had described. It wasn't a person hiding. It was a movement, a completely wrong movement. Out of the corner of my eye, I stopped walking immediately. Between two large trees about 30 yards from us, a shadow formed. It was tall, taller than an ordinary man, and it was thin. Too thin in a way that didn't seem natural. It didn't hide from us. It just stayed there, a perfectly outlined silhouette against the deeper darkness, a stain even darker than the darkness itself. Then it moved again, and it was that movement that broke my logic, that broke something inside me. It didn't walk, didn't run. It slid. The figure moved from that tree to another about 5 yards to the side in a fraction of seconds, without making a single sound. It was a smooth, impossible movement, as if it were black smoke sliding down an invisible wall. It repeated the gesture, getting closer. It slid from trunk to trunk, an elongated silhouette that seemed to stretch and contract each time it stopped. I felt as if a pair of eyes were fixed on me, although I couldn't see face or features or anything. The firewood I was carrying fell from my arms, making a dry noise that broke the silence. Gabriel, realizing I had frozen, asked in a trembling voice, "Matthew, did you see it?" I could only nod. I couldn't speak. It seemed like the air had disappeared. Beside me, I heard Bridget let out a strangled sound, a sob of terror. She tried to scream, but what came out was a high, weak shriek. We were all like that, trapped. We wanted to run, scream, do anything, but our bodies simply wouldn't obey. The figure stopped behind one last tree, dangerously close to us. We could only see its outline, watching us from the darkness. The seconds seemed to never pass. Then a voice tore through the silence. It was Gabriel. "Run, now." His order was what broke our paralysis. Survival instinct finally kicked our brains into gear. Nobody thought, nobody looked back. We just ran. We ran desperately, stumbling over roots, over thin branches, scratching our faces and arms. The only sound in the world was our panting breath, the noise of our feet crushing the forest floor, and Billy's frantic, terrified barking as he ran for his life alongside us. We burst out of the woods like a pack of scared animals, stumbling toward the clearing, panting, dirty with earth. We ran to the campfire, which by then was just a little pile of red, pulsing embers. For several seconds, nobody could speak. We stood there hunched over, hands on our knees, trying to suck air with our burning lungs, trying to understand if all of that had been real. It was Gabriel who lifted his head first. He aimed the flashlight toward one side of our campsite, and we all looked in the same direction. The firewood was there, but it wasn't just there, it was perfectly stacked in a way none of us would do. The branches were aligned by thickness, from thickest to thinnest, forming a perfect rectangle. It was a much more organized pile than mine, almost decorative. That wasn't relief, it was mockery. It was a message, a terrible message. The creature hadn't lured us into the woods for just any reason. It was playing with us. Nobody said a word. What could we say? The proof that we weren't crazy was right there in the form of that impossible pile of wood. The panic from running gave way to a frozen confusion that was almost worse. Billy, who had calmed down for an instant, started growling again. That same low, vibrating growl directed toward the darkness we had just fled from. Gabriel knelt beside him, his hand on the dog's fur. "Easy, buddy, easy. Everything's okay now." And it was at that moment that it happened. It was fast, too fast for the brain to process it. We heard a single sound coming from the darkness. It wasn't a fight, it wasn't an attack growl. It was a yelp, a short, sharp, and terribly muffled yelp, as if a giant hand had covered the dog's muzzle mid-bark. And that sound was followed by a wet snap, a moist sound of something breaking with violence, and then absolute silence. "Billy," Gabriel called, his voice going up an octave and breaking in panic. He aimed the flashlight toward where the dog had been, just 1 or 2 yards from him. There was nothing, the ground was empty. We ran over there. Lying on the dry leaves, we found Billy's leather collar not cut, but burst, as if it had been ripped off with absurd force. And beside it, a dark, thick puddle was beginning to form on the forest floor. A trail of blood led from there, and dragged toward the tree line, disappearing into the darkness after a few yards. Nobody screamed, nobody cried. I think the shock was too great to allow any normal reaction. Gabriel stayed on his knees in the dirt, looking at the broken collar in his hand, repeating the dog's name in a whisper that could barely be heard. We didn't discuss it. In robotic silence, we took down the tents, threw everything haphazardly into the truck bed, and got out of there in the middle of the night, leaving behind the dying campfire, and that perfectly arranged pile of firewood as bizarre proof of what had happened. Our friendship, which had seemed so strong, simply fell apart after that night. Gabriel never blamed me out loud, but I could see it in his eyes. The guilt was mine. I was the one who worried about the firewood. I was the one who started that walk toward death. To this day, when I close my eyes in the silence of my room, I can still hear it. It's not my fear, it's not my friend's screams that I hear. It's that short, muffled yelp and the wet, final sound of something breaking in the darkness. Good evening, my name is Sergio. What I'm about to tell you happened quite a few years ago. But to this day, when the silence of the highway presses in, the memory returns with all its force. I'm a trucker, a life I inherited from my father. Back then, I was going through a complicated phase. I had just blown a fortune on a complete engine overhaul for my truck, an old Kenworth that was my livelihood. The shop bill drained my savings and left me in debt on top of it. I was accepting any freight job that came up without thinking twice. It was in that situation that Vincent called me. Vincent was a freight broker, a middleman. Everyone in the business knew his reputation. He got the strangest hauls, the ones that paid too well to be legitimate. I had already turned down a couple of his jobs before, but as they say, necessity has a voice that screams louder than common sense. I was in my mother-in-law's kitchen, having a cup of fresh coffee, when the phone rang. "What's up, Sergio? Can you talk?" His voice sounded a little raspy on the call. "Depends on the business, Vincent," I replied drily. "Calm down, man, it's something good. A job came up for you quick, 1 day only, good pay in cash, half up front." He made that pause I already knew, the pause of someone about to drop the problem. "It's a private transport, kind of, discreet." That word discreet already gave me chills. In our language, that could mean anything from smuggled goods to something much worse. "Discreet how? What kind of cargo?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Vincent let out a little laugh. "It's just carrying some wooden crates from one ranch to another here in the region. The owner is elderly folks, doesn't like strangers or people asking too many questions. That's why I thought of you, you're trustworthy. You do your thing and you're gone." The offer of cash money up front was exactly what I needed to pay off the debt with the shop. I fought against my own intuition, that voice screaming at me to hang up and forget about the whole thing. But the image of the mechanic's receipt in my wallet won. Vincent gave me the address, and the next morning I was there. I took a dirt road of that red clay that the sun cracks and rain turns to soap. After almost half an hour of getting shaken up, I saw the barbed wire gate he had mentioned. The place was simpler than I had imagined. A large plot with the wilderness already eating away at the edges, a small house, and a tin-roofed shed that gleamed under the hot sun. As soon as I stopped the truck, 2 men came out from inside the shed. They were figures that time had punished, skinny, quiet, with burned skin. One of them, the older one, was chewing a toothpick in the corner of his mouth. They didn't even say good morning. "You the freight guy Vincent arranged?" asked the younger one with a dragging voice, without much enthusiasm. I just nodded, confirming. The older one then approached and extended his hand, not for a handshake as I thought at first. "The keys," he said, short and dry. "We'll back the truck in to load it." That raised an anger in me that I could barely hide. "Sir, I don't know if you or whoever's listening understands this, but the truck is sacred to a trucker. It's our home, our tool. Nobody puts their hands on another person's truck. It's an unwritten rule of the road." "No need, boss. I'll back it in myself. I'm used to tight maneuvers," I said. The man didn't move an inch. He just kept staring at me with sunken eyes that seemed to have no end. The silence that followed was heavy, and I understood the message. I was the intruder there, and the rules were theirs. I felt my pride break, but I swallowed hard and handed over the keys. I stayed outside in the packed dirt yard, feeling useless. From there, I watched how they loaded the 3 crates. And what crates they were, enormous, made of dark, almost black wood that looked ancient. They were absurdly heavy. It took both of them and a third who came out of the darkness of the shed to lift each one. They had no handles or anything to help. The men lifted them by pure brute force, with that low grunt of someone at their limit. When one of them passed close to me to climb into the truck bed, I smelled something strange. It wasn't the smell of old wood, much less of rot. It was something chemical, sweetish, mixed with a strong smell of wet earth, of basement. That's when I noticed a detail. The wood was visibly old, but the cracks and corners at the bottom were full of dark, damp earth. Fresh earth, as if they had just dug that stuff up. After they closed the truck bed, the same man returned my keys, along with a thick manila envelope. There's what was agreed on. Check it later. Now just deliver and that's it. And who do I deliver to? I asked, putting the money in my pocket without even looking at it. He pointed with his chin toward the road. Keep going straight on that path. You'll come to the entrance of La Providencia Ranch. A man will be waiting for you. You'll know who it is. Unload, don't sign anything, and no talking needed. Understood. I nodded, got in the truck, and got out of there without even looking in the rearview mirror. The dirt road stretched in front of me, a red cut through the middle of the dry brush. You couldn't see a house or a power line, nothing. Just the midday sun heating the cab and the dust cloud I was raising forming a cloud that followed me. My cell phone, as expected, was completely without signal. It was just me, the engine's roar, and that strange cargo in the bed. The crates themselves made no noise, but their presence seemed to weigh in the air. And with the increasing heat, that smell I had sensed at the ranch began to invade the cab. It was a weak but cloying smell, the mixture of chemical sweetness with damp earth. My head started working, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Antique tractor parts, artwork from some eccentric artist, I needed a logical answer to calm myself down. But none seemed good enough. I had been driving for almost an hour in tense monotony when I passed a sharp curve at the edge of a small ravine. That's where I saw the first cross. Simple wooden cross stuck in the earth. Unfortunately, it's something you get used to seeing on highways, but this one looked new. The wood was still light, the name painted by hand with thick black ink. You could read it perfectly, Abelardo 2001. It seemed sad, of course, but I continued on my way. The problem was that about 50 yards ahead there was another one, exactly the same, in the same position. Benito 2002. At that moment I felt the sweat on my forehead turn cold. That wasn't right. They were too similar, too aligned. I reduced speed, almost stopping, my eyes fixed on the side of the road. There was no doubt. A little further ahead, the third cross. Same shape, same ink. Ciro 2003. Abelardo Benito Ciro. 1 per year in sequence. I stopped the truck on the shoulder. The engine kept vibrating, but other than that, the silence was absolute. I looked at those 3 crosses. One of them had the remains of a plastic flower faded by the sun, tied with wire. That wasn't a tribute to accident victims. It was a marker, a warning. I felt the hair on my arms stand up even in the suffocating heat. I got back in the cab as fast as I could, locked the door, and floored it. The rest of the trip was hell. Every creak of the suspension, every stone that hit under the chassis made me jump. On a steeper climb where I had to shift into first gear, the cargo in the bed settled with a dull, heavy thud. And at that moment, I can swear by all that's holy, I felt something roll back there. Not like a crate tipping over, but like a heavy body turning on its own axis. My first reaction was to want to stop, open the bed, check the tie-downs. But the image of the 3 crosses came to mind, and the memory of the man's voice. I wasn't going to open that truck bed for anything in this world. I took advantage of a harder break and looked in the small rearview mirror that gave me a minimal view of the bed through the rear window of the cab. A sliver of sunlight was coming through the poorly closed tarp and illuminating a piece of the first crate. That's when I saw the mark. It wasn't a scratch. It was a symbol burned into the dark wood, deep like the ones used to brand cattle. It wasn't a letter or a drawing. It was a twisted, aggressive shape, something that felt wrong just looking at it. And the wood around it seemed to have darkened with heat, as if the mark had contaminated the surrounding area. I kept driving with my body tense, feeling every shake of the truck differently. Fear had become a knot in the pit of my stomach. I just wanted that road to end. And after what seemed like a lifetime, it ended. I came face to face with a more robust wooden gate, and on a weathered plaque was carved La Providencia Ranch. And standing next to it, as if he had appeared out of nowhere, was a man. He was a gentleman appearing to be about 70 years old, but with a firm posture. He wore a light dress shirt, polyester pants, and a simple hat. In one hand, he held a dark wooden cane that he used more as a symbol of authority than out of necessity. When I got out of the cab, the relief of finally arriving mixed with a new fear. His gaze was calm in a way that disturbed me. "You must be Sergio," he spoke with a hoarse voice that didn't waver. "That's me, yes. Here's the delivery." He looked over the truck bed, and then at the uneven dirt ground outside the property. "You can unload and leave it right there." The request was so strange that it took me a while to process it. The terrain was a disaster, full of undulations and roots. Leaving those heavy crates, there was a guarantee they'd tip over and maybe even burst. "But sir," I hesitated, realizing I didn't even know his name. "Ferez," he completed with a neutral expression. "You can call me Mr. Ferez. Any problem." "It's just that the ground here is very uneven, Mr. Ferez. If I just leave them there, the cargo might tip over. It's very heavy." He stared at me for an instant, and you couldn't tell what he was thinking. There was no anger or hurry. It was an ancient coldness. "Don't worry about that. The contents won't complain. Just leave the crates there on the ground." The phrase, "the contents won't complain," hit me full force. Without having more to say, I opened the tarp and started the work. I lowered the first crate using all the strength I had, feeling a pull in my back. Then the second, and finally the third, the one with the brand mark. When I set it on the ground, it tilted to one side, and I heard again, very clearly, the muffled sound of dead weight shifting inside. Mr. Ferez watched everything, motionless, leaning on his cane. When I closed the truck bed, sweating and with my heart beating hard, I turned to leave. His voice, however, made me stop. "The trip was quiet, Sergio." The question seemed harmless, but it caught me by surprise. "Yes, sir. The road's bad, but you get used to it." He took a step in my direction, and for a second I felt that same smell of earth and chemicals coming from the crates. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "You didn't hear anything different on the road then?" A thud perhaps, or some kind of lament. I simply froze. The image of the three crosses, the weight rolling on the curve, everything flashed through my head in an instant. And I lied. I lied out of pure fear. No, sir, nothing at all. Just the engine noise. Mr. Ferraz then smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a cold, empty gesture of the lips. Excellent, he said in a low voice. Good that you didn't hear anything. It's a sign that the trip was peaceful for them too. I didn't even answer. I just got in the cab, started up, and got out of there, spinning tires in the dirt. Through the rearview mirror, the last image I had was of Mr. Ferraz, a dark silhouette, standing next to the three crates against the sun that was already starting to set on the horizon. I drove aimlessly for a while, foot buried in the accelerator. Fear had become my fuel. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that ranch. When I passed again through the stretch where the three crosses were, I did what anyone with an ounce of sense would do. I prayed quietly and asked for protection. And it was at that exact instant that the truck radio, which had been off the whole time, emitted a loud, sudden shriek. A sound of pure static tore through the silence. But for a second, just 1 second, it wasn't just noise. Under the racket, there seemed to be a voice. A long, dragged, distorted lament that got lost in the shriek. As quickly as it came, the radio went silent again. I got home late at night. My wife noticed my paleness, asked if I was okay. I lied, said it was just road fatigue, a heavy day. I took a long shower, trying to wash off not just the red dust, but the dirty feeling of that day. It didn't work. That dawn, sleep didn't come. I sat in the kitchen chair in the dark, and the whole story came together in my head, and the pieces fit in a horrible way. The urgency in Vincent's voice, the men at the ranch who wouldn't let me get near my own truck, the absurd weight of the crates, the damp earth stuck in the cracks of the wood, the smell, the three crosses with names in year sequence, Abelardo 2001, Benito 2002, Ciro 2003, and Mr. Ferraz's final phrase. It's a sign that the trip was peaceful for them too. Them he didn't say for the cargo, he said for them. I didn't just haul crates that day, sir. I made a delivery of bodies, or worse, of something that was once people but was now something else. Something that needed seals branded with fire to stay quiet. Something they buried, and for some reason I don't want to imagine, needed to transport from time to time. And those crosses on the road weren't a warning. They were a record. I accepted that job for money, to get out of debt. But the price I pay to this day is much higher. Years have passed, but sometimes when I'm alone on a dark highway, I turn off the music, and in the absolute silence of the cab, I could almost swear I hear a weight dragging slowly in the empty bed behind me. It's just my head, I tell myself. But the fear that stayed with me from that day, that's real. It always travels as my passenger. My name is Ronald, and I'm writing because something happened to me actually. It happened twice, and I've never been able to completely shake it off. I'm not sure how to begin, but I think the right thing is to go back to when I was about 9 years old and talk about my Uncle Roger. I think every family has a figure like this, right? My Uncle Roger was my dad's younger brother, and it was like he lived on a different frequency from the rest of us. My dad was a man of routine, with fixed schedules for everything. But my uncle, he appeared and disappeared. lived on the road hauling freight in an old Dodge Dart that smelled of dust and cigarettes. When he showed up at the house, it was a whole event for me at least. He brought strange gifts, told stories about places that seemed made up, about highways that never ended. I was fascinated, but my mom didn't like him. I noticed the way she talked to him, always with suspicion, her voice lower. I remember hearing her and my dad talking in the kitchen late at night after Uncle Roger left. The conversation was always the same, that he couldn't settle down, that this life wouldn't lead him anywhere, that he was a bad influence. The truth is, my uncle had a kind of sad air about him, something in his eyes that I only understood much later. He was the type of person who seems not to belong anywhere, and maybe that's why the places he passed through seemed more important to him than people. He wasn't a bad person, not at all. He was just displaced. It was during one of those visits, at a Sunday dinner at my grandmother's house in a small town in rural Oregon, that everything began. Those dinners were a tradition. The whole family gathered, the noise of people talking loudly, the smell of home cooking in the air. And in the middle of it all, there was Uncle Roger, quiet in his corner as always. The afternoon dragged on with that stifling heat, and the adults' conversation had already died down. That's when my uncle got up, slapping his pants to brush off dust that didn't exist, announcing he was going to hit the road, that he didn't like driving through the mountains too late at night. The idea of going back with my parents in the stuffy car, listening to the same music as always, seemed like punishment. I wanted the road, the night, my uncle's stories. I ran toward him. "Uncle, can I go with you?" I asked with the voice you use when you know you're asking for something complicated. He looked at me and smiled sideways, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Fine by me, champ, but you have to check with your folks." My mom opposed it immediately. I saw how her brow furrowed, how her lips pressed into a thin line. "Absolutely not. It's late, the mountains are dangerous, you're coming with us." "Let him be, woman," my dad intervened with that tired tone of someone who doesn't want arguments. "Roger knows those roads like the back of his hand. There's no danger." She looked at both of them, visibly upset, but finally gave in. 20 minutes later, I was in the passenger seat of the Dodge Dart with a loose seatbelt, waving goodbye through the window. My uncle's car had a very distinctive smell, a mixture of old cigarette smoke with something like dried grass. We got on the highway, and for an hour everything was normal. The lights of the small town were left behind until they disappeared completely. And then we began climbing Devil's Ridge. That's what everyone called that stretch. The road became a dark, winding thread swallowed by dense vegetation on both sides. A low fog began to form, making the headlight beams seem weak, almost useless against the total darkness. I was starting to fall asleep, lulled by the car's rocking, when an urgent need to use the bathroom woke me up. I tried to ignore it, but it became unbearable. I was embarrassed to say it. My dad always reminded me to go before any trip, but I had no choice. "Uncle, I need to pee," I said in a low voice, almost a whisper. He didn't scold me or even seem annoyed. He just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the curved road ahead of us. I saw a strange expression on his face, a kind of seriousness, concern. "Hold on a little longer. There's a pullout up ahead." A few minutes later, he slowed down and pulled the Dodge Dart into a small dirt pullout. It was a patch of packed earth between the highway and the cliff. There was one of those concrete water tanks for overheated cars, and a low guardrail that looked dangerously fragile. I jumped out of the car and ran to the darkest corner, turning my back to the road. The night air was freezing, a cutting cold that rose from the bottom of the ravine. The only sound was the wind whistling low among the rocks. When I finished, my uncle was leaning against the car's fender, smoking. The tip of his cigarette was the only warm light in that scene. He wasn't looking toward the road but down, toward the darkness of the gorge. "Did you hear that?" he asked suddenly. Without turning to look at me, I stood still, trying to listen better. "I only heard the wind." "The wind," I replied. He shook his head. "It's something else. Funny, your luck, we stopped at the exact spot." I approached him, suspicious. The way he said it gave me a bad feeling, and it wasn't because of the cold. "What place is this, Uncle?" He looked at me intently for a long moment, as if measuring whether I could handle it. "Do ghost stories scare you, Ronald?" I lied, feeling my stomach churn. "No." "Good, because this place has an owner. Down there," he pointed with his chin toward the abyss. "The old folks called her the Mother of Stone. They say she was a woman, or something that pretended to be one, that did evil things here in the mountains. One day she got trapped, nobody knows how. Some say she stayed out past dawn and couldn't return to her hiding place. Others say people messed with things they shouldn't have and tied her down there. The only certainty is that she's still there, trapped in the rock." I laughed, a nervous laugh without humor. "You're trying to scare me." "No, I'm not." His voice was grave, without a trace of joking. "Sometimes you need to know that evil really exists, kid, so we learn to value the good. So we have faith in what protects us. I only believed in certain things myself after I saw them with my own eyes. And she's right down there. Want to see? Just so you know it's not a tall tale." I don't know if it was to prove something to my uncle or out of pure childhood stubbornness, but I nodded, saying yes. I wanted to prove to my uncle that I wasn't scared. Little did I know what I was doing. He threw the cigarette butt into the abyss, where it disappeared instantly, and signaled for me to follow him. He locked the car and began carefully climbing down the rocky slope. It wasn't a path, it was a pile of loose rocks and slippery dirt. For every step he took, I needed 3 to keep up. "Stay quiet now," he whispered, stopping behind a huge boulder. That's when I heard it again, and this time it wasn't the wind. It was a low, continuous sound, almost like a hiss that transformed into a long, drawn-out moan, a lament that seemed to come from the earth itself, from inside the rocks. My uncle leaned against the rock and pointed down, a little to our right. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it would burst from my mouth. I forced my eyes to adjust to the almost total darkness, and I saw her. Down there between 2 giant rocks, there was a silhouette, a dark, hunched shape similar to a person, but wrong. What impacted me most was the way one of her arms moved. It wasn't a fluid, human movement. It went up and down slowly in jerks, like a dry branch being dragged by wind. But there was no wind down there. It was a mechanical, broken movement. It looked like a body that was falling apart. Then that thing turned its head in our direction. I didn't see a face, didn't see eyes, but I felt that it looked at us. In that instant, all my childhood bravery crumbled. The fear paralyzed me. It was pure animal terror. I turned around and began climbing back without thinking, scraping my hands on the rocks, crying quietly, desperate. I reached a steeper part and my hands slipped. I couldn't climb. The panic paralyzed me, and then I felt my uncle's 2 hands on my feet, pushing me up with force, giving me the impulse I needed. I reached the pullout and ran to the car, pulling the handle with trembling hands. I could barely breathe. My uncle arrived right behind me, his face serious, breathing heavily. We got in and he locked the doors. We sat in silence for a minute, with only the sound of my agitated breathing. Then he took off a leather cord from around his neck. From it hung a small bag of thick fabric, a charm. "Take it," he extended it to me. His voice was low and grave. "I wish you didn't need this so soon, but now you know. And whoever knows about these things needs protection." I took the object with still trembling hands. "This won't make your fear disappear," he continued, starting the engine. "Fear is good, it keeps you alive. This is to keep you safe despite it. Now it's yours. Take good care of it." He put it in gear and accelerated, the tires squealing on the dirt path. When we returned to the asphalt, I didn't look back. I just clutched that charm in my hand with all the strength I had. Many years passed after that night. The first thing I remember about the next morning was my mom's shouting. She was furious with my uncle, saying he had no right, that I was just a child, that he had traumatized me. Uncle Roger left that same day, and I started seeing him less and less. Over time, the memory of that night in the mountains began to lose clarity, transforming more into an old nightmare than a real memory. The charm, I kept it in a drawer, a strange and dusty secret from my childhood. Life went on. I grew up, got married. My uncle died about 5 years ago from liver problems, alone in a small rented room in some city whose name I don't even know. Life continued until last year. My wife, her sister Deborah, and I were coming back from a weekend at some friend's house. To shorten the trip, we decided to take the famous Devil's Ridge. It was already night. I hadn't been through there in at least a decade. Before leaving, while arranging some things in the car, I found the charm in a box of old junk. I can't explain why, but I felt the impulse to take it. I hung it on the rearview mirror, more as a joke, a silly memory. Our car, a popular model already showing its age, began struggling on the steep climb. The engine groaned loudly, strained. Just when we entered the most isolated part of the ridge, with fog starting to descend again, the charm simply came loose and fell in my lap. A second later, the temperature light on the dashboard lit up red and blinking. The car lost power completely. "I can't believe it," I said, hitting the steering wheel. I had no choice but to pull over at the first place that appeared. A dirt pullout squeezed between the highway and the cliff, with a concrete water tank and a low guardrail. A horrible sensation took hold of me, and it wasn't because of the cold air. It was the same place. I knew it. I had absolute certainty. The same huge rock where my uncle had leaned, the same dark abyss. My wife and Deborah got out to stretch their legs, complaining about the setback, the cold, the lack of cell signal. I stayed seated at the wheel, paralyzed, staring at that landscape that for 20 years I had tried to convince myself was nothing more than a children's story. I got out of the car trying to fake a calm I didn't feel even remotely. I opened the hood more to put on a show than for any other reason. The engine was crackling from the heat while I stared without seeing at the tangle of parts. My sister-in-law Deborah was walking around the edge of the pullout with her phone in her hand. "Hey, what a sinister place," she said, more fascinated than scared. "The wind makes a weird noise here, doesn't it? It sounds like, I don't know. My wife, whom I had told the whole story to some years before, tensed beside me. She looked at me with wide eyes. What noise, Deborah? Her question came out tense, her eyes fixed on me. That one, don't you hear it? Deborah replied, turning toward us. It sounds like crying, like a very low lament. And then I heard it, the same sound, the same drawn-out moan that had haunted my memories for 20 years, coming from the bottom of the abyss. My wife grabbed my arm tightly. Ronald, don't tell me this is the place. I couldn't answer. I just looked toward the gorge, toward the exact point where the darkness was deepest. That's when the sound changed. It became louder, clearer, and worse. It seemed to be closer, as if something was climbing in our direction. Let's go, I said with a broken voice. Get in the car, now. I didn't have to say it twice. We slammed the doors shut, and I turned the key in the ignition, praying. The engine protested but started. I accelerated without caring about the warning light on the dashboard and returned to the highway as best I could. Nobody said a word for several miles. Deborah was curled up in the back seat, finally scared. My wife stared straight ahead, pale. It was only then that I looked down. The charm was still on the car floor near my feet, and a horrible, heavy certainty fell over me. It hadn't been bad luck. The car hadn't broken down by chance. That object wasn't a shield, it was an anchor, a call. My Uncle Roger, in his twisted, melancholy way, hadn't given me protection. He had passed me the burden. He had marked me so that the road, and what lives on it, would always know where to find me. The fear I feel today isn't about stopping at that ridge again. It's the fear of knowing that somehow I never really left there. Good evening, Dom. My name is Sylvia, and I've always been the type of person with her feet on the ground, you know. One of those who listens to a story and immediately starts looking for the logical explanation. The window that slammed shut in the wind, the pipe that made a noise. For everything there was a reasonable answer. Or at least, that's what I believed. My husband William and I live in an apartment in a regular residential building, one of those with several identical towers. It's our little corner, and until recently, our family was completed with the arrival of Shadow. He wasn't just a cat. Anyone who has an animal at home like a child will understand what I mean. Shadow was my peace. William works a lot, comes home late almost every day, so most of the time the only company I had was that little animal. All black with shiny, soft fur. He had the habit of sleeping on my chest, followed me from room to room, from the living room to the kitchen, from the kitchen back to the living room, and stayed watching me with that sleepy gaze, blinking very slowly while I tried to concentrate on work. He was the good silence, the presence that made the apartment seem less empty. It was precisely because of him that we spent money we didn't have to spare on safety screens for all the windows and the balcony door. The balcony is tiny. It only fits one pot with a fern and another with a spider plant. But it was our paranoia. The number one rule of the house was, before opening anything, check the screen. And we always did, always. Our routine ended on a Tuesday. An absolutely ordinary day, hot, a little muggy. I had finished working, tidied up some things around the house, and when I looked at the clock, it was already past 6 in the evening. I went to the kitchen, took the bag of kibble, and shook it, making that little noise that Shadow heard from any corner of the apartment. I called him once, twice. The silence that came as a response was the first strange thing. I started looking, still calmly. I looked in our bedroom, under the bed, opened the closet, checked his litter box. Nothing. I went to the utility room, then to the small office where I work. Each empty room gave me a knot in my throat. He always came. Just hearing the sound of kibble in his bowl was enough. That's when I noticed the balcony glass door was just leaning against the frame, not secured with the top latch. I felt my heart skip a beat. I went over there, holding my breath. The safety screen looked normal taut. But I crouched down, ran my hand along the base where it meets the concrete ledge, and I felt it, a scratch, a small cut, almost invisible, right next to the aluminum frame. A defect that wasn't there in the morning. A small space, but large enough for a small, determined body to squeeze through. I couldn't process it. I called William, my voice already broken by tears, barely able to form sentences. He tried to calm me from the other end of the line, said he was coming right away. That shadow must just be hiding, scared, in some corner of our floor. But I knew he wasn't. The hole was there. When William arrived, it was already dark. We went down and began the most horrible search of my life. We covered the ground floor of the building, a space with a little grass and some half-dead plants. We called him, our voices sounding loud and desperate in the silence between the towers. We searched the parking garage, under every car, in the dark corners that smelled of humidity and oil. I called the few neighbors we exchanged good mornings with through the intercom. Nobody had seen anything. The night wasn't passing hot and humid, and with each minute that went by, I was losing hope. We returned to the apartment past 2 in the morning. We were exhausted, defeated. William barely managed to take a shower and collapsed in bed. He said we'd continue in the morning. I couldn't even think about sleeping. I stayed sitting on the living room couch in the darkness, with the only light being from a street lamp that came in yellowish through the window. The silence inside the house was heavy, painful. A silence that only proved Shadow was no longer there. I looked at his scratching post in the corner, the cushion that was near the TV. Every object that was his seemed to accuse me. The crying had already dried up. Now it was just an exhaustion inside, a feeling of complete emptiness. I had nothing left to do, nowhere else to look. It was over. And it was there, in the middle of desperation, that a silly memory came to my head. Something my grandmother from a small town in rural Texas used to say when we were kids. She said that when you lost something very important and the search led nowhere, you could ask for help from the other side. But there was always a price. You always had to offer something in exchange. To me, that seemed like nonsense, a superstition from old folks. But in that moment, when reason served no purpose, desperation took hold of me, and I spoke. It was in a low voice, a whisper in the dark living room, more for myself than for anything that might or might not be listening. Look, if you really exist, bring him back. Bring Shadow back to me. Put him here at the door. I just want my cat back. I'll give you $500. It was what I had in my wallet. As soon as I said it, I felt like an idiot, talking to myself, making a promise to, what? The exhaustion and sadness make you say the dumbest things. That's all it was, I repeated to myself. Words thrown into the air. And I went to the bedroom, knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep. I must have spent about 2 hours tossing and turning in bed, in a state between sleeping and awake. Every noise in the building gave me a start. The elevator arriving at another floor, the creaking of furniture wood, the refrigerator motor turning on and off. Sleep simply wouldn't come. I took my phone from the nightstand to check the time. 3:20 in the morning. The city outside was in almost total silence. That's when I heard it. The sound came from the living room door, and it wasn't the scratch of an animal. It wasn't the sound of keys or someone stumbling. It was a knock, slow, spaced out, and clear, as if a person were knocking with their knuckles with a calmness that made no sense for that hour of night. 3 deliberate knocks with intention. I was paralyzed in bed. William was sleeping deeply, snoring softly beside me. Who could it be? A neighbor needing help, but the knock didn't have urgency. On the contrary, it had a patience that gave me a strange fear. I got up slowly, without making a single sound, and walked on tiptoes down the hallway. The house was in complete darkness. I reached the door and put my eye to the peephole. The hallway was completely empty. The weak emergency light on the floor painted everything a strange yellow, but there was nobody there. Nobody. My heart raced. I waited a full minute, motionless, holding my breath. The silence had returned. And then I heard it softly, coming from the other side of the door. A meow. A meow I knew better than my own voice. It was Shadow. In that instant, the relief was so great that it erased the fear. It was such immense relief that my legs buckled. I unlocked the door with a speed I don't know where I got from, and there he was, sitting right in the middle of the entrance mat, with his tail curled around his body, looking at me as if it were the most normal thing in the world. But the strange part was his condition. He was impeccable. His black coat was clean and shiny, not a dirty paw, not a scratch. Nothing to indicate he had fallen from a height of 7 floors and spent hours on the street. He looked like he had just come out of our bedroom. I took him in my arms, cried, kissed him, smelled his scent. I went back to the bedroom and shook William. "Honey, wake up. Shadow's back. He's back." William sat up in bed with a start, disoriented. When he saw the cat in my lap, relief flooded his face, but then came confusion. How did he come back? Did someone find him? "They knocked on the door," I said, my voice still tearful. I heard his meow, ran to open it, and there he was, just sitting there. William stayed silent for a moment, observing me in a strange, serious way. It seemed like he understood before I did. "Sylvia, what did you say earlier? That time on the couch about asking for help." The memory of my promise, of my desperate whisper in the dark living room, hit me like a wall. The heat of relief vanished instantly, and in its place came a knot in my stomach. "Something answered," William said, his voice almost disappearing. "Good thing he's back, but for the love of your life, never do something like that again. Never." The days that followed were strange. I tried with all my might to convince myself that it was nothing more than a bizarre coincidence. Maybe a neighbor who works the night shift found Shadow, left him at our door so as not to wake us with the intercom, and gave a light knock to let us know. It was a weak explanation, full of holes, I know. But it was the only explanation that helped me move forward. The other one, I didn't even want to think about the other one. The $500 bill remained folded in my wallet. Every time I saw it, I felt a stab of guilt and fear. But it was impossible to ignore that things weren't normal. Shadow had changed. That cat who was my shadow, who wouldn't give me space, now seemed to avoid my touch. Sometimes when I extended my hand to pet him, he would recoil completely, his fur even standing on end. He stopped sleeping in our bed. He spent most of his time curled under a chair, and he started doing something that caused me agony. He would stare at nothing. He would sit in the middle of the hallway for entire minutes, eyes fixed on a point on the wall where there was absolutely nothing. Motionless like a black statue, just staring. And his meow was different. It was no longer that affectionate call. Sometimes he would let out a low, guttural sound that came from deep in his chest and didn't sound like a cat. I began to feel like an intruder in my own home. When William left for work, the silence filled with constant tension. I felt watched, even being alone with the cat. Every creak of the wood, every noise from the neighbors left me alert. A week passed, exactly 7 days since that night. I was already at my limit, trying not to go crazy, convincing myself that everything was stress, things in my head. We were lying down, the light already off. William was almost asleep. It must have been past 2 in the morning, and that's when it happened again. The sound came from the living room door. The same 3 slow, rhythmic knocks, with a calmness that was even more frightening. Exactly like the first time. This time there wasn't a second of doubt. What I felt was pure fear, the kind that paralyses you. My whole body went rigid, and I grabbed William's arm with such force that it woke him instantly. "What's wrong?" he whispered, scared by my state. The door was all I could say, my voice failing. "Listen." We both stayed absolutely motionless in silence. Nothing. No other sound outside, just the heavy silence of dawn. No footsteps, no meows, nothing. "I didn't hear anything, Sylvia. You must have been dreaming." But I hadn't been dreaming. I was wide awake, and I knew with a certainty that was pure instinct that this knock hadn't been a mistake. The first time the knock came to deliver. This time, no. This time it came to collect. I didn't sleep a wink that whole night. Neither did William. We sat on the living room couch in silence, watching dawn break through the window. The simple possibility of hearing those knocks again was a form of torture. The next night, the fear was so great, so unbearable, that it transformed into a kind of twisted courage. I knew what I had to do. "I'm going to pay," I told William. My voice came out weak. "Pay what, Sylvia? Don't do that. We don't know what we're dealing with. It's better to just ignore it." "Ignore it," I replied, feeling hysteria rise in my throat. "Ignore it until it decides to knock again or do something else. I made the promise, William. I need to keep it." I waited for the clock to strike 3 in the morning. It seemed like the right time, their time. I took that specific $500 bill from my wallet. The paper seemed to burn in my trembling hand. I went to the living room door, and each step I took in the dark hallway seemed to echo throughout the house. I had the clear, almost physical sensation that there was something on the other side of the door, waiting. I unlocked both locks. The sound of the keys turning was absurdly loud. I opened the door just a crack, the minimum possible for my arm to pass through, and placed the folded bill exactly in the center of the mat, in the same place where Shadow had been sitting. I slammed the door shut and locked everything again, the top lock, the bottom one. I turned all the turns the keys allowed, and then we waited. The whole night, sitting on the couch, without the courage to go to the bedroom. There was no sound, no noise, an absolute silence that was 1,000 times more terrifying than any knock. When the first signs of dawn appeared, creating a grayish, weak light, I gathered the courage to look. I walked to the door with my heart pounding, peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I took a deep breath and opened the door wide. The money was gone. I felt a strange relief. It had worked. It was over. But that feeling lasted only 1 second, because I looked down at the mat. The money wasn't there, true, but in its place, right in the center, there was a single black feather. Small, with an oily shine, different from any bird feather I had ever seen. I closed the door slowly. I didn't touch the feather. I left it there outside. The knocks never came back, but neither did the piece. I feel that by paying the debt, I only showed that I had understood the deal. I showed that I understood the message and that I know how the rules work. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up and see Shadow sitting at the edge of the bed, just watching me in that new way he is quiet and empty. And I wonder what I really brought into my house. The debt was paid, yes, but I feel deep down that my account with them is still open. Good evening, sir. What I'm about to tell you happened back in 2015, but there are nights when it feels like yesterday. I know you've heard all kinds of stories, so maybe mine won't sound as crazy to you as it does to me when I try to tell it. My name is Marcus. Back then, I was a corporal in the army. Our mission was simple on paper, but everyone knew it wouldn't be easy. We had to enter a zone of illegal mining operations to find one of our own, Private Rodriguez, a 19-year-old kid who disappeared during a patrol about 2 weeks prior. The lieutenant said it was a search and rescue operation, but we all felt it was already too late. I felt somewhat responsible, you know. Rodriguez was new to the platoon, a small-town kid who saw us as family. I'd promised his mother over the phone that I'd look after her son. We were 12 men. They dropped us off at a dirt road that disappeared into dry, desert vegetation. The air was still heavy, with a heat that suffocated. But the strangest thing was the silence, not a cricket, not a bird, nothing. Just the sound of our gear shifting and our boots on the fine dust. We'd glance at each other occasionally. Nobody commented, but everyone noticed. That silence was louder than any scream. After almost an hour of walking, we found the first thing out of place. One of our guys at point made a signal for us to stop. There, about 30 feet into the scrubland, was the frame of a car. It was completely burned out, flipped on its side with the rusted body pointing toward the sky. Near it, an open suitcase with women's clothes scattered on the ground. Stained in a way nobody wanted to look at too closely. The sergeant just shook his head, ordered us to mark the point on the map, and keep moving. Nobody said anything about Rodriguez, but the image of that car made us all start imagining the worst. That place didn't want us there. We continued advancing, but the silence from before had been replaced by a tension you could feel in the air. The scrubland grew denser, the path narrower. Suddenly, the sky that had been clear turned gray. It wasn't a normal sunset. It was like someone had thrown a dirty rag over everything. Then the rain fell. It wasn't rain, it was a downpour. The water came down hard and heavy. In less than a minute, we were completely soaked, and the dusty trail turned into a slippery, muddy mess. In that chaos, Private Barrett stepped wrong in a puddle and twisted his ankle. It wasn't anything that broke the bone, but he could barely put weight on his foot. We had to improvise support with 2 of us carrying him. The pace slowed, and frustration started weighing more than our packs. That's when Lieutenant Vega stopped and looked at the compass on his wrist. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice muffled by the rain. "North won't stop moving." The sergeant tried to use the GPS he carried, a more modern device, but the screen went blank. No signal, not even one bar of connection. We were alone, and worse, we were lost. The lieutenant's order was clear: return the same way until we got radio signal. It was the only logical thing we could do. We walked for about 20 minutes in what we thought was the right direction. The rain diminished, becoming just a cold drizzle. When we rounded a curve that seemed familiar, we came upon the burned car again. My stomach churned. It didn't make sense. We'd walked too long to return to the same spot. Some of the guys laughed, a nervous laugh, but most stayed silent. The worst part wasn't being in the same place. The worst part was that one of the garments, a woman's blouse, was no longer on the ground. Someone, and I swear it wasn't anyone from our group, had hung it on a branch near the car. The garment was dripping water as if it had just been placed there. The lieutenant looked at it, looked at our faces, and said only one thing: "Nobody separates, keep walking." We continued forward, but the formation was no longer the same. Nobody looked just ahead. Eyes moved to the sides, toward the shadows between the trees, searching for any movement. The lieutenant tried to keep morale up, saying the humidity might have affected the compass, that we must have taken a wrong fork. Nobody believed him, but nobody argued. Obeying was the only thing that still kept us together. It was Caden, one of the younger soldiers, who suddenly stopped. He was breathing hard, his gaze fixed on a point ahead. "There's someone there," he whispered, more to himself than to the rest of the group. I saw it, a silhouette moving. The soldier at point denied it instantly. "It's clear, Caden. There's nobody up here." We continued, but now Caden kept looking back. And that's when more people started to notice it, a low murmur, like the sound of a distant conversation. We all stopped in absolute silence, pointing our weapons toward the closed scrubland. The sound ceased. We thought it might be the echo of our own voices, a trick of the wind through the leaves. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. It was something else. We moved slower, and one of our guys made us stop again. He didn't say anything, just pointed with his rifle barrel toward the muddy ground. There were tracks there. They weren't boot marks or combat boot prints. They were long footprints, like those of a barefoot man, but the toes were too long, too thin. And strangest of all, they sank into the mud as if whatever made them weighed a lot, but there was no sign that anything had dragged. The tracks simply appeared, made a turn, and disappeared near a dry creek. The lieutenant told us not to get distracted, that we were starting to see things. But I saw his face. He was as disturbed as we were. We followed some machete marks on some trees, thinking they might be a sign from the miners, a path. It was a terrible idea. Those marks didn't lead anywhere. They guided us to an even more closed part of the scrubland where light barely reached. We were being led, and it wasn't toward an exit. After almost 2 hours walking in circles through that humid scrubland with the feeling that something was watching us, we finally found him. It was more by chance than our merit. On a slight rise, the trees opened into an irregular clearing, and there was the miners' camp. The place had been abandoned in a hurry. There were 4 or 5 improvised tents made of black tarp and wood. In the center, an extinguished fire with a pot on top, food still half finished. Everything seemed to have been left in the middle of an action. We advanced in formation, covering the angles, but there wasn't a single sound. It was the same heavy silence from the beginning, as if the place was holding its breath. While we searched the tents, we found more signs of panic: scattered clothes, a portable radio emitting static, a shirt dirty with blood. Outside the tents, the ground showed what had happened. There were dozens of bullet casings scattered everywhere. It didn't look like a shootout, a confrontation. The casings were in chaotic positions, as if the men had fired in all directions in the darkness against an enemy nobody could see. The boot marks in the mud went in all directions. It was Private Avila who found him. Near an improvised latrine, he stepped on a loose board on the ground. The sound was hollow. He kicked the wood, and underneath, in a tight hole, there was a man. He was alive, but he didn't seem to really be there. His eyes were bulging, his whole body trembling, covered in mud. In one of his hands, he clutched a small, dirty scapular tightly. When we pulled him out of there, he didn't resist. The lieutenant approached him. "What happened here? Where are the others?" The lieutenant's voice was firm, but the man didn't respond. He just babbled senseless things. "It didn't see me, it didn't see me." Our medic gave him some water and took off his soaked shirt. That's when we saw the marks on his back. They were long, parallel scratches. They didn't look like animal marks or knife wounds. They looked like finger marks, very long fingers that had grabbed him with absurd force. Suddenly the man grabbed the lieutenant's arm, his eyes full of terror. "You can't stay here," he whispered in a hoarse voice. "It's still out there." "It who?" asked the lieutenant, trying to free himself. The miner let out a short laugh without humor. "It's not him. It's that thing. That thing that walks but doesn't step on the ground. That thing that laughs without making noise, that calls you with the voice of whoever you love most." At that moment, he started screaming, a sharp, desperate scream that echoed through the clearing. "It's going to get you all too." We had to tie him up to prevent him from hurting himself, but his gaze was no longer on us. He was looking toward the tree line, toward the darkness that was beginning to swallow the scrubland. And we looked too. For the first time there, fear became certainty. The lieutenant decided we'd spend the night there. Going out in the darkness with one injured man and another tied up would be suicide. We set up guard shifts and reinforced the perimeter with what we found: some wire, some old logs. But we all knew that wouldn't stop anything. It was just to keep our hands and minds busy. Night fell suddenly, and with it came a cold that wasn't from the weather. The miner we'd found had stopped screaming. Now he only whispered, staring at nothing. I got the dawn shift with Diaz. The silence was so complete it buzzed in our ears. That's when we heard the footsteps, slow, heavy, outside our perimeter. They sounded like someone walking calmly through the mud, but when we pointed our flashlights, there was nothing. Just the dark scrubland staring back at us. And then came the whistle, 3 short, clean, sharp notes coming from above, from a treetop. A chill ran through all of us, and it wasn't from the weather. That wasn't human. Suddenly, someone screamed. It was Caden. He was crouched on the ground with his hands over his ears. "It's calling me," the poor guy cried like a child. "It's his voice." Nobody understood at first. Then the voice returned, a little clearer, coming from the darkness, and everyone froze. "Help! Someone help me." It was Rodriguez's voice, the voice of the kid we'd come to find. "Corporal Marcus, please get me out of here." I felt everything freeze inside me. It was him. It was his exact voice. For a second, my body wanted to run toward the sound. It was my duty. but the lieutenant shouted, "Don't move, it's a trap." Caden didn't obey. He got up and tried to run toward the scrubland, screaming Rodriguez's name. We had to hold him down with force. He writhed, cried, completely broken. While we struggled with Caden, I looked toward the edge of the clearing and saw it. Standing between two trees, there was a silhouette. It was tall, too thin, and seemed made of darkness. It didn't move, just watched our desperation. That thing was playing with us. It was hunting us for fun. The rest of the night was hell. Rodriguez's voice continued calling for hours, sometimes asking for help, sometimes just crying. Nobody slept. We stayed all together, back to back, waiting for the sun. Dawn came strangely, a gray that brought no relief, just more exhaustion. At that same instant, the lieutenant's radio started emitting static. Base was calling. The voice on the other side sounded normal, clean, as if nothing had happened. The return was in absolute silence. We turned over the miner, who never spoke another coherent word again. In our official report, there was nothing about voices or silhouettes or strange tracks, just hostile terrain and combat stress. Nobody brought up the subject again, but none of us came out of their hole. Caden requested discharge for psychological problems a few months later. Others requested transfers. That platoon disbanded. I'm still living my life, sir, but that thing marked me. Sometimes when I'm walking down the street at night, or glance quickly at a dark corner of my room, the air around me seems to become heavier, and I feel like I see it, that tall silhouette standing there, just watching. I don't know what that was in the scrubland, but I know it saw us. It played with us and decided to let us live. And I don't know if that was a favor or if the real torture was exactly that, remembering it forever. Good evening, sir. What I'm going to tell you happened several months ago, but there are nights when I close my eyes and I can still smell that forest, feel the weight of that air. My friends Alina and Paul avoid the topic. I suppose for them it was just a scare, a bad night. For me, it was something else. The camping idea was Paul's, of course. He lives with this whole vibe of reconnecting, feeling the earth's energy. I've never been like that. I like my couch, concrete, the security of knowing where I am. But the truth is, back then, I would have accepted anything to avoid staying home on the weekend, staring at the walls and thinking about what my life had become. I'd ended a 5-year relationship just a few weeks before, in that stupid way where you don't really know where you went wrong, you just know it's over. The silence in my apartment was driving me crazy. So when Paul showed up with a crumpled map and a gleam in his eyes, talking about a hidden clearing in the mountains about 3 hours from Denver, I simply said yes. Alina, who's always the balance point of our trio, looked at me a little suspiciously, but didn't say anything. I think she understood I needed to get some air. We climbed the mountain on Saturday morning. The car struggled a lot on the dirt road full of ditches, but the place was really beautiful, a sea of green hills, the air becoming purer, more humid. We found the famous clearing late in the afternoon. It was an almost circular space surrounded by tall, twisted trees, with the ground covered by a thick layer of dry leaves. There was a peace there, an ancient tranquility. We set up the only tent big enough for the 3 of us, lit a fire, and stayed talking about anything while the sky went from orange to dark purple. For a few hours, I managed to forget everything, the warmth of the fire on my face, the sound of crackling wood, and my friend's laughter. It was good, it was normal, and that was all I wanted. We went to sleep around 1 in the morning. I fell asleep quickly. The exhaustion from the trip and the hike finally overcame me. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was sudden, that pressure in the bladder you can't ignore. I moved carefully so as not to wake the others, grabbed my jacket, and slipped out of the tent. And that's when everything changed. There was no warning. It wasn't a fog that descended little by little, as is normal in the mountains. It was a wall, a dense, white barrier that seemed solid. In 1 second I was looking at the tent zipper, and the next I couldn't see anything a foot from my face. The fire we'd left with some strong embers had simply disappeared. Its light couldn't penetrate that thing. It was a heavy, frozen, humid fog. The air became difficult to breathe, and a strong smell of wet earth and rotting leaves entered my nose. I stood still, trying to understand. I turned toward where the tent should be, but there was no outline, no color, just that thick white. I took a step back, or what I thought was back, and my hand didn't find the tent's fabric. "Alina," I called in a low voice, not wanting to make a scene. My voice made no echo, it was swallowed as if I'd shouted inside a room full of foam. The silence that came after was heavy, total. There were no crickets, no wind, no sound of any animal in the forest. Nothing. My heart started beating faster. I tried again, now louder. "Paul, Alina." Silence. A silence that seemed like a physical thing, a pressure in my ears. I started walking with my hands stretched forward like a blind person. 1 step, then another, dragging my feet so as not to trip over any root. I just wanted to find the tent, the fire, anything. But with each step, I felt like I was sinking deeper and deeper into that sea of nothing. I called again, now shouting, my voice already scratchy, starting to break from panic. "Hey, where are you?" The answer was the same, that emptiness. It was then that it hit me with full force. I was no longer in the clearing. I didn't know where I was. I was completely lost. The first instinct is to fight. You walk, you shout, you try to use logic. I forced myself to stop. I thought, breathe, Nick. If you start walking randomly, it'll be worse. I tried to remember the direction of the tent, but what direction? There was no moon, no stars, no reference, just me and the white. And it was in the silence that I started hearing things. First, a branch broke to my right. The sound was clear. I stood completely still, holding my breath. I waited. Nothing. I took a careful step, and almost a second later, I heard another step sounding exactly like mine, coming from somewhere in front of me. I stopped again. The other sound also stopped. It was an echo, but it wasn't an echo. It was an imitation. I had the absolute certainty that there was someone else there with me, moving at my same rhythm. That's when I heard Alina's voice. "Nick, over here." It came from my left, a little distant. I felt such great relief that my legs went soft. "Alina, I'm coming." I shouted and started walking in that direction, almost running. "Where are you?" I walked and called, but she no longer responded. The sound of her voice had disappeared. I stopped, confused, and then I heard Paul, now coming from behind me. "Dude, we're here, come back." I turned instantly, my heart beating out of control. How could they be in 2 places at the same time? That didn't make sense. It was the fog, it was distorting everything, playing with me. Or maybe it wasn't them. That thought left me paralyzed. I kept walking aimlessly, no longer trusting what I heard. Every creak of a leaf, every branch brushing my clothes made me jump. And then came the smell. It was no longer just wet earth. It was a sour, metallic smell. You know, the smell of rust, of old, oxidized things. It was that. It got all the way to the back of my nose, left a bad taste in my mouth. It was the smell of something wrong, something that didn't belong in that place. I lost track of how long I walked. It could have been minutes or hours. The cold had gotten into my bones, and I was shaking uncontrollably. That's when I tripped over a root and fell to my knees on the wet, frozen ground. And there, with my hands in the mud, I gave up. The energy simply disappeared from my body. I rested my forehead on the cold earth and no longer felt like getting up. I was lost, alone, exactly how I felt even before entering that forest. The difference was that now it was literal. I didn't scream anymore. I didn't call anymore. I stayed there, waiting. I don't know exactly for what, maybe just the end. I don't know how long I stayed there, on my knees in the mud. The cold was so intense, I didn't even feel the shivering anymore. That's when I lifted my head and saw him. At first, it was just a dark shape in the middle of the white, a tall, thin silhouette motionless like one of the trees. I thought my head was finally playing a bad trick on me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the shape was still there. And then it moved. One slow step, soundless, then another. It wasn't a tree, it was a man. He came closer slowly, and the fear I felt was different. It wasn't the panic from before. It was something deeper, more silent. He stopped a few feet from me. He was an older man, maybe around 60, thin, with a face full of deep wrinkles. He wore dirty rubber boots, muddy, thick fabric pants, and a simple buttoned shirt. He didn't seem cold. He didn't seem scared. He seemed to belong to that place. His gaze had no pity or curiosity. It was just calm, a calm that seemed impossible in that situation. We stayed looking at each other in silence for an instant that never seemed to end. He was the one who spoke first. His voice was deep, a little hoarse, with a marked accent from somewhere rural. "Walking alone, young man." I could only nod. The words wouldn't come out. He looked at me and then looked at the fog around us, as if he could see it in a way I couldn't. "The mountain doesn't lose anyone," he said. "It just shows a person how lost they already were inside." That phrase, sir, I swear, that phrase hit me like a stone. It was as if he knew, as if he could see through me, through the camping, through the breakup, through everything. I got up slowly, my whole body aching. That's when I put my hand in my jacket pocket out of pure habit and felt the emptiness. My phone had fallen when I tripped. There it was, my last call, the last messages, her photo, everything lost in that darkness. The man turned his back to me. The gesture was simple, unhurried. "Come on, I know where they are," and he started walking. I didn't think about it, I didn't hesitate. What else could I do? Stay there and die of cold? I followed him. The walk was the strangest thing I've ever experienced. He didn't look back, but I knew he felt my presence. He moved with absurd confidence, dodging branches and roots that I only saw when they were right in front of me. The most bizarre thing was the forest around us. The ground seemed to give a little with each step, too soft, as if I were stepping on something alive. Out of the corner of my eye, the outlines of tree trunks seemed to curve in our direction, straightening quickly when I turned to look. I saw shapes, small, fast things moving in my peripheral vision. But when I focused, there was nothing. And all the time, absolute silence. Just the sound of my clumsy steps and the soft brush of his clothes on the branches. He made no noise when stepping. I don't know how long we walked. I completely lost track. It could have been 10 minutes or 2 hours. Then he stopped. I stopped right behind him, my heart hammering in my chest. He slowly raised an arm and pointed forward. "Look there." I strained my eyes. In the middle of all that white, there was a point of light, a weak, trembling light. A flashlight. And then I heard Alina's voice, now real, without distortion, screaming my name. The light of the flashlight and Alina's voice were like a blow of reality. I ran, stumbling over my own feet, toward them. The hug Alina gave me was desperate, strong. I felt her body trembling. "Nick, my God, where were you?" she said, her voice breaking. "We looked everywhere for you." Paul arrived right behind, his face pale, with deep dark circles. "Dude, what a scare you gave us." We screamed until we were hoarse. I was breathless, trying to process everything. I turned excitedly to introduce the man who had saved me, to thank him. "Listen, a man helped me. He's right here." But there was nobody behind me. Just the same dense fog slowly retreating among the trees. The forest silence had returned. The man, the guide, had simply vanished. They looked at me without understanding. I tried to explain. I talked about the man, about his calm, about how he guided me. I saw in their faces that they weren't believing me. They thought I was delirious from cold, from fear. And for a moment, even I doubted. We returned to the camp in silence. Little by little, the sky began to clear, and the fog dissolved, revealing the wet trees, the churned ground. Our tent was there, intact. We sat near the ashes of the fire, not knowing what to say. That's when my gaze fell on my backpack, and beside it, on a smooth stone that I was sure had been empty before, was my phone. I took the device, expecting it to be dirty with mud, broken. But it was perfect, as if someone had picked it up, cleaned it, and placed it there in the most obvious place for me to find it. I showed it to Alina and Paul. It was the first time I saw doubt in their eyes, too. "I don't know what happened that night, sir. I don't know if that man was a forest spirit, a hallucination, or something I can't even name. But today, I understand what he meant. I entered that mountain already lost, running from an emptiness that was inside me. The fog just gave it form. And that figure didn't save me. He just showed me the way back. The rest I had to walk alone. I haven't forgotten my problems, but now they seem different, smaller. Because once, on a cold dawn, I stood before something much bigger. And that, in a strange and terrifying way, put me back on my axis. My name is Carlos. I decided to write because honestly, I don't know who else I could talk to about these things. I'm not going to give my last name or the exact place where this happened. I think it's a mix of fear and maybe shame. I just need someone to know, so it doesn't stay locked inside my head. I'm what people call a handyman. I do a bit of everything, fix a leak here, change an outlet there, assemble furniture. I live off odd jobs. The money is almost always little, but it's enough to pay the bills and keep going. My real problem is different. Since I was a child, I've had something. It's hard to explain. It's like my eyes sometimes catch certain dirt, certain static from reality that nobody else seems to notice. It doesn't happen always, thankfully. But every time I've tried to talk about it, it's gone badly. I already lost a girlfriend. I've gotten weird looks from family. My grandmother used to say that some of our people are born with eyes too open for our own misfortune. I learned the hard way to keep quiet, to see and pretend I didn't see. The job appeared on a Tuesday, if I remember correctly. The phone rang. It was for a somewhat bigger repair. Fix some broken shingles and check a major leak in the roof of an orphanage. The pay was good. It would save the month. The address was far, beyond the industrial zone where the asphalt gets ugly and then ends. I took the motorcycle and headed there. After about 15 minutes on a little dirt road that punished the suspension, I arrived. It was a very old estate, surrounded by a high, peeling wall. You could tell that once this place had its beauty, but now it just seemed tired, abandoned. The heavy iron gate was just leaning against the wall. I pushed it, and what hit me immediately wasn't what I saw, but what I didn't hear. Silence, but it wasn't that good silence of peace. It was a heavy, dense silence, like the air itself was old and dusty. A smell of wet grass mixed with strong disinfectant permeated everything. I left the motorcycle near a centuries-old mango tree and walked across the dirt patio. There was nobody around, just a few children's clothes hanging on a clothesline, motionless. There wasn't a breath of wind. A thin man in his 50s appeared at a side door. He wore a button-up shirt yellowed by time and had a gaze that, although tired, never stayed still for a second. Yes, his voice wasn't friendly or harsh. It was just empty. I introduced myself, told him I was Carlos from the roof repair. He nodded slowly, as if I'd interrupted a very long thought. "Ah yes, the roof guy. It's this way." He led me through a dark hallway that smelled of stored things, of closed places. The floor was polished cement, and the walls had paint peeling in several spots from humidity. He showed me the hatch that led to the roof. Before leaving me alone for the work, he stopped and commented, almost as if talking to himself. "The children are in the back patio now, in the afternoon. If they make too much noise, I apologize." I thought the comment was strange, considering the total silence of the place. I thanked him and climbed the metal ladder. I left the toolbox on the floor and took a general look. The roof was large, with those old clay tiles. Several of them were broken or out of place. The job was going to take time. That's when I looked down toward the back patio, and there they were. There must have been 8, maybe 9 of them. And they weren't making any noise. They were playing with a deflated plastic ball, but it was a slow, apathetic game, almost like theater. That silence I'd felt when I arrived made complete sense now. The children didn't scream, didn't run. It was a game without energy, a rehearsed, somewhat sad game. I stayed there observing for an instant before starting to work, and that's when I saw it. First in a girl wearing a very faded pink dress. Then in a boy with a soccer team shirt so worn you couldn't see the logo. And then in all of them. Always in the same place, on the left side of the neck. It wasn't a scar. It wasn't a birthmark. It was something different. It looked like a very fine spider web of dark veins, almost black, that spread beneath the skin. And the most bizarre thing, I swear, when I focused my gaze, it seemed like that thing was moving. A minimal pulsation, very slow, as if it were a nest of something alive in there. I felt my stomach turn. That wasn't normal. I tried to concentrate on the work. I started removing the broken tiles, measuring the leak area. But my eyes and my head kept returning to the patio, to those marks. When I went down at the end of the afternoon, the caretaker, Don Vicent, was sweeping the kitchen entrance. I approached, forcing my voice to come out casual, as if I were commenting on the weather. Don Vicent, excuse my curiosity. I noticed the children have kind of a strange mark on their necks. Is it some skin condition, some allergy? He stopped sweeping immediately, but he didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the leaves he was gathering on the ground. He stayed like that for about 2 seconds, standing. Then he slowly raised his head and smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a dead smile. "Mark," he said with a calm that didn't fit, "I don't know about any mark, son. The children here are all very healthy, must be ideas of yours. The strong sun on the head sometimes plays bad tricks on us, don't you think?" He didn't give me a chance to respond. He turned his back and went into the kitchen, leaving me standing there with the absolute certainty that I hadn't imagined anything, and with the bad feeling that he knew exactly what I was talking about. I spent the rest of the week with that image in my head, that spiderweb of dark veins pulsing slowly, and the caretaker's dead smile. The smartest decision would have been to leave the job, invent an excuse, and never set foot in that place again. But the truth is I needed the money, and a part of me, the stupidest and most stubborn part, needed to understand. Or maybe I just needed proof that I wasn't finally going crazy. I returned the following Monday. The same silence, the same dense air. I went up to the roof, and almost by instinct, the first thing I did was look toward the back patio. There were fewer children. Before, I was sure there were 8 or 9. Now I counted 6. I tried to create logical excuses in my mind. They could be sick, maybe punished inside, or some relative appeared and took them away. But none of those explanations seemed to fit with the atmosphere of that place. That night I dreamed about the marks. In the dream, I was no longer on the roof observing from afar. I was down there in the middle of the patio, and the children were standing around me. The marks on their necks weren't just dark. They glowed with a sickly purple light, and I could see through their skin that it wasn't superficial. They were like fine roots slowly burying themselves in the flesh, searching for something inside. I woke up with my heart racing, short of breath. The dream had been too real. The day that defined everything for me was on my 3rd visit. I was gathering some old tiles near the hatch to throw them away later when one of the girls ran past me. She must have been 7 at most, and she had the mark there, very clear. In the middle of her run, she tripped over a piece of wood and almost fell to the ground. I managed to catch her by the arm in time. "Whoa, careful there, little one." She looked at me with big, very serious eyes, without a trace of the agitation of a girl who almost fell. "Thank you." I crouched down to be at her height. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I knew I shouldn't, that it was a terrible idea, but the question escaped me before I could control it. "Hey," I said in a low voice, "that thing you have on your neck, does it hurt?" And I pointed with my chin. The girl frowned. An expression of pure confusion crossed her face. She passed her little hand over the exact place I indicated, on the left side of her neck. Her hand slid over that dark spider web. "This what?" she asked with a completely neutral voice. "I don't have anything here." Here I insisted like an idiot. "Yes, you have that dark spot. It looks like little lines." She looked at me as if I were a complete stranger speaking a language she didn't understand. She shrugged with an indifference that gave me chills. "You must be confusing me with someone else. I don't have any spot." And then she simply turned around and ran off without looking back, joining the others in their silent game. I stayed there, crouched on the dirty floor, feeling the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't that they were hiding the mark. It was infinitely worse. They didn't know it existed. The mark wasn't in their world. It only existed in mine. It was at that precise moment that the discomfort turned into real fear, a fear that starts in the pit of your stomach. Because I understood that whatever that thing was, for some reason it had chosen me to see it. And I was alone in this, completely alone. Going to the police, telling them what? That I'm seeing invisible spots on children and I think they're disappearing. They'd laugh in my face before taking me for an evaluation. I'd already tried going to a psychologist once, years ago, and came out of there with a stress diagnosis and a handful of prescriptions. I learned that the official path was closed to me. I was no longer just a guy fixing a roof. I was a witness, and I started to understand that there's nothing more dangerous than being the only witness to a crime that nobody else can see. I finished the job at the orphanage as quickly as I could. With each hammer blow, with each tile I set in place, I felt the eyes of that place on me. When I was done, I went to collect payment from Don Vicent. He didn't ask why I'd finished everything ahead of schedule. He showed no surprise. He just handed me the envelope with the money and closed the door in my face. I left there on the motorcycle, swearing to myself that I'd never return. But it was useless. Leaving there didn't take the place out of me. The image of the children, of the lifeless game, of that dark spiderweb on their necks, all of it spun in my head nonstop, especially at night. I felt dirty, as if I were an accomplice just for knowing about the existence of that thing. And I needed an answer, any answer that wasn't, "You're going crazy." The police wasn't an option, my family much less. So I did what a person without options does. I looked for a solution that doesn't make the slightest sense. I'd already heard a story told by an uncle of mine about an old man who lived in some little houses by the river area, in a neighborhood where nothing new arrived anymore. Some said he was a healer, others that he was an herbalist, and the most malicious said he was half a witch. His name was Ramon. It took me about 2 days thinking about the idea. One evening, when I finally gathered the courage, I took the motorcycle and went there. I found his house at the end of a dirt alley. It was a humble little house of wood and sheet metal, but it had a good smell of forest and fireplace smoke. A very old man, thin as a dry branch, was sitting in a wicker chair at the door, cleaning some leaves with a small knife. He saw me arrive but showed no surprise. His eyes were sunken and seemed not to blink. "Good afternoon," I said, stopping at a respectful distance. He just made a slow gesture with his head. The silence was heavy, and I felt it wasn't worth beating around the bush. I put a bottle of good mezcal and a pack of leaf cigarettes I'd bought on the way on the little table beside him. He looked at my hands, then at my face. He took the things without hurry. "Sit down, boy." His voice was hoarse, worn. I sat on a crate that was nearby and told him everything. I tried to be as objective as possible so as not to sound like a complete lunatic. I talked about the job, about the silence, about the apathetic children. I described the mark, the spiderweb of veins, the slow pulsation that only I could see. I told him the children were disappearing little by little, and that the caretaker was pretending nothing was happening. While I talked, he just listened, smoking his leaf cigarette and releasing the smoke very slowly, mixing with the evening air. When I finished, he stayed a good while in silence, looking at nothing. I started to think he was going to laugh at me or kick me out. But then he spoke, and his voice was pure resignation. "Those children have already been delivered." The phrase hung heavy in the air. "Delivered? How do you mean delivered?" He finally turned those sunken, dull eyes toward me. "There are pacts, son. Very, very old agreements. So old that people forgot they exist. They're not agreements with horned-tailed demons like in the movies. They're with things that have hunger, and their hunger isn't for food." I felt my whole body tense up. "And why children?" "Why," he said with a simplicity that was scary, "it's what has the most value. A child's life doesn't have the malice and weight of ours. It shines brighter, feeds better, and lasts longer." The image from my dream, of the roots searching for their hearts, returned with full force to my head. My voice came out almost in a whisper. "But who makes a deal like that? In exchange for what?" Don Ramon let out a short laugh without a trace of humor. "Who do you think, son? People who already have everything and still their everything is never enough. You think they dirty their hands? No. They pay, and there's always someone who accepts the money to do the dirty work. The children don't disappear, Carlos. They're relocated. And nobody's ever going to ask about them, because most of the time they don't have anyone in the world who would ask that question." I looked at him desperately, hoping he'd give me a solution, a prayer, a ritual, anything. "And is there a way to break that?" I asked. "Is there a way to save the ones who are still there?" He looked at me with deep pity, a sadness of someone who had already seen this happen many times. "No, you can't do anything. And my advice is that you don't even try. This is bigger than you, bigger than me. It's an ancient cancer that has already spread everywhere. If you poke at it, the only thing you'll achieve is making the cancer notice you. And it always devours whoever realizes it exists." I left Don Ramon's house with my legs shaking. Night had fallen completely, and the way back on the motorcycle never seemed so dark, so full of shadows in the corners. Every car headlight that appeared in my rearview mirror made me hold my breath. The truth that old man gave me was much worse than any monster I could have invented in my head. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't an apparition. It was a system. And I was just an insect that had the bad luck to see the gears from the inside. From that day on, I made a decision. I chose to be a coward. I chose to forget. I threw myself into work in an almost sick way, accepting any job that appeared, no matter how small, just to keep my head busy. From the moment I woke up until the hour I collapsed from exhaustion in bed, I started refusing any calls that were for that direction of the city. I changed the route I took to visit my mother on weekends. I created a bubble around myself and prayed that nothing would burst it. For a while, it seemed like it was going to work. The weeks turned into a month, then two. The memory of the orphanage, of the children, and of the marks became more distant, like a nightmare you try hard to erase the details of. I was almost managing to convince myself that it had all been nothing more than a psychotic episode, a hallucination caused by stress and the strong sun on my head, as the caretaker had said. Until last night. I got home exhausted after spending the day installing some lamps in a 2-story house. I went straight to the bathroom to wash my face, to remove the dust and tiredness from my body. The house was silent, just with the sound of running water in the sink. I threw cold water on my face, and when I raised my head to look at myself in the mirror, with my face still dripping, I saw it. For one single, terrible second, Under the yellowish, weak bathroom light on the left side of my neck, there was a shadow, a small, very fine spiderweb of dark veins, almost imperceptible just beneath my skin. I froze. My heart stopped. I blinked hard, and when I opened my eyes and looked again, there was nothing there. I rubbed my neck hard, the skin turned red, but there was no mark, no spot, absolutely nothing. It was just my skin as always. But I saw it. In a blink, in a reflection, in the water, I saw it. It could have been just for an instant. It could have been a trick of the light, my head playing the final joke on me. But I don't believe that. I think Don Ramon was right. The cancer noticed me. And now I understand that there's no such thing as unseeing something like that. There's no way to go back to being who you were before. You're no longer just a witness to something strange. Somehow, you become the dirt, the problem. The problem isn't that you look at something strange. The problem is when that thing looks back at you, and it likes what it sees. Good evening, everyone. My name is Victor, and I need to tell you about something that happened to me in Phoenix, Arizona, back in 2022. It's about a gated community, a child in a window, and why I'll never look directly into someone's home again. I think we pass hundreds of streets in our lifetime, and 99% of them are just that, pathways to get somewhere else. But sometimes, one of them marks you forever. For me, it was Saguaro Vista Estates, a dead-end street inside a private community that taught me to fear what might be watching from behind glass. I'd landed a job delivering 5-gallon water jugs for Desert Springs Water Company. Hard work under the Arizona sun, but I actually enjoyed it. The physical labor kept me in shape, and over time, you get to know every corner of the city, every street, every customer. I had a fixed route through the south side of Phoenix, always the same neighborhoods, which gave me a sense of routine, of knowing the territory. Saguaro Vista was on that route, a private community with an electronic gate and a security booth that was always empty. The place was the definition of tranquility. Smooth asphalt, well-maintained palm trees, and about 20 to 30 houses, all variations of the same southwestern adobe style, with low walls and xeriscaped front yards. Most residents were retirees, snowbirds who'd escaped to the desert for their golden years. It was the kind of place they sell you as an oasis of peace and security, and honestly, it looked the part. The only noise you'd hear inside was mine, the plastic wheels of my hand truck clicking against the asphalt joints as I wheeled the water jugs around. Every Friday afternoon, I had deliveries there. It had become a ritual. Park the truck outside, open the gate with the company's access code, and make my rounds on foot. What struck me as odd was how few children I saw in that place. Maybe it caught my attention because I'm very close to my nephew Leo. He was about 6 at the time, that age when kids are at peak curiosity, wanting to touch everything, ask about everything. But in Saguaro Vista, there was an almost total silence. The house that interests me in this story is the third one on the right side. A beige stucco house, just like all the others, with one unique difference. It was the only one with black iron security bars on all the windows and the front door. I'd never delivered water there. My clients were further back in the development. But for some reason, I always noticed that house. Maybe it was the bars that broke the orderly pattern of the place, or maybe it was just my imagination. It was just another house on my Friday route. At least, that's what I thought. It was one of those Fridays, a scorching day with temperatures over 90 degrees, when the routine broke. I was pushing the hand truck halfway down the street when I passed in front of the house with the bars. I wasn't even going to look, but something, a movement in my peripheral vision, made me turn my head. That's when I saw him. In the living room window, behind the glass and iron bars, was a little boy. He must have been Leo's age, maybe 6 or 7. He was pale with very dark, straight hair. What seemed strangest was his clothes. He was wearing a thick red wool sweater in 90-degree heat. He stood there just staring at me. It wasn't the curious stare of a child, you know. It was a fixed, heavy gaze, as if he'd been waiting for me to pass. He had both hands at chest level, holding a piece of paper against his body. I stopped the hand truck for a moment and nodded, an automatic gesture. He didn't move. He just kept staring at me with that intense look. I felt uncomfortable, like an intruder. At the time, I thought he must be someone's grandson visiting. Poor kid locked inside the house on a day like that. The bars on the window suddenly gave me a bad feeling, like a prison. I looked away and continued on my route, pushing the hand truck a little faster than normal. It wasn't fear, just uneasiness. The following Friday, I confess I went to work with that on my mind. I wondered if I'd see the boy again. And sure enough, when I passed the house, there he was. Same place, same window, same red clothes, same fixed stare at me, and the same crumpled piece of paper against his chest. This time I held his gaze longer, tried to smile, but got no response. He just stared. This repeated the next Friday and the next. For almost 2 months, it became a macabre event in my routine. Arrive at Saguaro Vista, feel that silence, push the hand truck, and when passing the third house, encounter the boy's eyes. The initial curiosity turned into anguish. I no longer thought it was a visiting grandson. No visit lasts that long, and no child wears the same winter clothes for weeks under that Arizona sun. I started obsessing. What was that paper he was holding? A letter. A cry for help. I'd slow down the hand truck on purpose, try to angle my head to see if the light would help distinguish what was on the paper, but it was impossible. His image began following me home. I'd think about my nephew and feel a tightness in my chest. That boy seemed so utterly alone. That place, once a symbol of peace, now seemed oppressive to me. The silence had a different weight. I could feel his gaze on my back even after I'd passed the house. I needed to know what was happening. It was destroying my peace of mind. Then one Friday, I saw my opportunity. When I entered the street, I saw an elderly man, thin, with completely white hair, watering plants in the yard of the house with the bars. My heart leaped. It was now or never. I left the hand truck in the middle of the street and approached him, trying to seem as casual as possible. "Good afternoon, sir. Everything all right?" He looked me up and down with a suspicious gaze. "Good afternoon," he replied dryly, not letting go of the hose. I took a deep breath. "Excuse the intrusion, but I pass by here every week, and I always see a little boy in your window." The man frowned. His expression hardened instantly. "A little boy?" he asked, his tone no longer friendly at all. "Yes, a small child with a red sweater. He's always there in that living room window," I said, nodding toward it. "I just wanted to know if he's okay. He seems so quiet, always inside there." He dropped the hose on the ground. The water kept running, forming a puddle on the desert landscaping. He straightened up and looked at me in a way that made me want to take 2 steps back. "Listen, young man, there's no child in this house. Only my wife and I live here." The certainty in his voice was like a punch to the stomach. I stammered, "But I see him every Friday. I'm sure of it." His face turned red with anger. "Are you calling me a liar? I told you there's no child here. There never has been. You must be seeing things at another house, or I don't know, you need to get your head checked." He turned around, picked up the hose from the ground with a brusque gesture, and went into his house, slamming the door. I heard the deadbolt turn from inside. I stood there on the sidewalk, feeling like an idiot, like a madman. But the image of the boy in the window was as real as the hand truck with the water jugs waiting for me in the middle of the street. One of us, the old man or I, wasn't telling the truth. And for the first time, I felt real fear. The following week, I went to deliver water to that development with great caution. I decided I wouldn't even look in the direction of that house. Enough of looking for trouble. If the old man says there's no one there, then there's no one there, and I must be going crazy. I passed the house with the bars looking straight ahead, concentrated on my path. I didn't see anything, didn't look for anything. I went to drop off some jugs at the last house on the street to a lady named Mrs. Ariadne, an old client and very chatty. While I was placing the jug in the dispenser for her, she commented, looking toward the entrance of the development. "Mr. Sebastian's grandson arrived, didn't he? Poor little thing." I froze. His grandson?" I asked, trying not to seem too interested. "Yes," she replied with the air of someone sharing inside information. "A lovely child, but very, very shy. His mother told me he barely speaks and doesn't like to go outside. He spends all day at the window, poor thing, just watching the movement. And Mr. Sebastian is very gruff, terribly protective of the child. He doesn't even like us to comment about it." In that instant, the world made sense again. I felt a relief that was almost physical, like a weight lifting from my shoulders. So that was it, a shy grandson and I, idiot that I was, creating a horror story. The old man wasn't a liar, he was just an overprotective grandfather. I felt like an imbecile. I finished my deliveries that day feeling light, laughing at my own paranoia. The mystery was solved. The next 2 or 3 weeks were the most peaceful in the world. The shy grandson story had put an end to the matter. I'd pass the house, sometimes glance sideways, but the window was always empty. I'd think, the boy left, and feel a certain pride in having solved the mystery. Saguaro Vista went back to being just a quiet, slightly boring place at the end of my route. Until one Friday with gray skies threatening rain, when the ground opened up again. I was almost finished with work, thinking about the weekend, when I passed in front of the house with the bars out of pure habit, not expecting to see anything. But he was there. My first thought was normal. Oh, the grandson came back to visit, but there was something different, very different. He wasn't just standing there staring at me. He was pressed against the glass with his whole body, and he was holding that same piece of paper from before. But now it was open, pressed against the window, as if, after all this time, he finally wanted to show it to me. I stopped. The hand truck was forgotten beside me. I squinted, forcing my vision. The light wasn't good, but I was close enough, and I saw it. It wasn't a scribble. It was a drawing, a childish drawing with crooked lines, but unmistakable. It was my white delivery truck with a crude imitation of the company's blue logo on the side. The 2 little black wheels, even the stick figure in the driver's seat. He had drawn every detail. I stood there breathless. The blood seemed to disappear from my face, and the explanation about the shy grandson, the protective grandfather, all of it went up in smoke in my head. Reality seemed to unravel before me. How my mind just repeated that question. How could he have seen the logo? He never approached the gate. He couldn't know the details. It was one thing for a child to look from the window. It was something completely different for him to know exactly what my work vehicle was. This wasn't observation. This was a message. This was for me. The relief I'd felt weeks before transformed into something cold and heavy in my stomach. The fear returned, but it wasn't the same fear as before. It was worse. It was the horrible sensation that reality had a crack in it, and I was looking through it. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the paper on the glass, my brain trying and failing to find logic. I took an instinctive step forward, toward the edge of the house's yard, and that's when I saw the final detail. The ink in the drawing was two colors. The truck and the driver's stick figure were black, but next to the truck, outside, there was another stick figure drawn in blue. It was standing with one arm raised, waving. And inside the house, next to the boy, an adult figure also in blue, and from its face came several lines, tears. But looking more carefully, that figure didn't look like a woman. It had broad shoulders, short hair. It was a man. He wasn't telling me about a mother who missed him. He was showing me the father who stayed behind, crying. In that second, the boy in the window slowly lowered the paper. His eyes met mine one last time, and there was nothing childish in them. It was a tired, ancient gaze. And then he simply turned around and disappeared into the darkness of the room. I don't know how I finished the deliveries that day. I think my body went into autopilot. I only remember leaving the truck at the company yard and going home with the image of that drawing burning in my mind. The next day, my route partner Julian, a guy with more time at the company, saw me in a corner, quiet. "What's up, Victor? You look like you've seen a ghost." I took a deep breath and told him everything. From the first time I saw the boy, the conversation with the old man, the stupid relief I felt, and the drawing. He listened in silence without interrupting me. When I finished, he stood there for a while, staring at nothing, and then said, "Hey, that development, I remember a story from many years ago. It was a very publicized case around here. A family lived in that house, the one with the bars. One day their son, a little boy about 6 years old, disappeared. He simply vanished from inside the house. They searched everywhere, police, firefighters, nothing. They say the parents went crazy with desperation. They moved away shortly after. They couldn't stand living there." My stomach churned. "They never found the boy?" I asked with a weak voice. "Never," Julian replied. "That I know of, no. What a sad story, right? Imagine a child's soul looking for his family, and they're not there anymore." A week later, I had to go to that street one last time to cover for a coworker. My heart was pounding when I passed in front of the house. I forced myself to look. The living room window was different. It was black. Someone had installed one of those blackout curtains inside, the type that blocks 100% of light. They didn't want to see out, or they didn't want anyone to see what was inside. And right in one little corner, pressed against the glass, I swear I saw a strand of thread, a single red thread. I requested a route change after that. I made up some excuse, and my boss accepted. I never went back into that development. But the story didn't end for me. Even today, when I close my eyes, I see that drawing and ask myself, why me? Why did he show that to me? Was it a plea for help, a warning? I feel like I should have done something, but I have no idea what. It's a feeling of failure, of having received a message and not being able to decipher it. Sometimes I drive past Saguaro Vista on my way to other neighborhoods. The electronic gate is always closed, the security booth still empty. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself slowing down, wondering if he's still there, still waiting at that window, still holding his drawing, still trying to tell someone his story. But I never stop, I never go back in. Because some messages once received change you forever, and some children once seen never really leave. If I had known that silence could cost so much, I never would have tried to break mine. It's curious. We spend our whole lives trying to fill the voids, don't we? With noise, with people, with whatever we can find. I just wanted to fill one specific void, one that hurt more than all the others. In the end, I ended up opening the door to something that made everything else empty. Good evening. I hope you're listening. My name is Fernando, and the story I'm about to tell happened about 2 years ago in El Paso, Texas. But the root of the problem goes back much further. My younger brother Diego had died a year before, and since then I'd been living on autopilot. I was alone in a small apartment, one of those places you rent without even visiting properly, right in downtown El Paso. The place became more of a hiding spot than a home. You know that smell of desert dust and hot concrete that seeps through the window even when it's closed? That was the constant soundtrack of my life. Most days I just went from work to home, ordered food through an app, and sank into the couch, waiting for bedtime so I could turn myself off. I couldn't stop replaying our last day together in my head. We'd had a stupid fight, sibling stuff about borrowed money, nothing serious. But the words I used were heavy, I was cruel. I saw the hurt on his face before he grabbed his motorcycle helmet and slammed the door of my old apartment. He left on the bike angry, hot-headed because of me, and he never came back. Guilt, my friend, is something physical. It's not just a thought. I felt it in my chest, in my lack of appetite, in a tiredness that wouldn't let me sleep well, but also didn't give me energy for anything. One Thursday, the silence in the apartment became so heavy I thought it would suffocate me. I decided I needed to get out, walk aimlessly, see people, whatever. I went to look for the key on the entry table. Nothing. I searched the pockets of my pants, my work backpack, rummaged through the couch. The key had simply disappeared. I stood there in the middle of the living room, feeling like the most pathetic guy in the world. Literally trapped inside my own loneliness. It was that feeling that made me look differently at a large cardboard box my mom had sent me months ago. It was there in a corner of the room, collecting dust. It was a box full of old family things, and I'd been postponing the moment of opening it because I knew it would hurt. But at that moment, it seemed like the only thing I could do. I sat on the floor and opened it. The expected smell of old paper flooded the air. There were school notebooks, childhood toys, and a bunch of photo albums. Seeing images of him smiling next to me was like getting punched in the stomach. And it was there at the bottom of the box, under everything, that I found it. A small diary with a worn, dark leather cover. It belonged to my paternal grandmother. I started flipping through it without much interest, reading about her day-to-day life on the ranch, recipes, notes about the weather, until one page caught my attention. The handwriting there was different, a bit rushed, shakier. It talked about something called the breath exchange, a ritual or something like that. A way, according to her, to open a crack to speak with someone who had already left. She said it had to be done at a crossroads of dirt after midnight. You had to bring an object that was important to the person and something from the one calling. In theory, it was a way to ask forgiveness or say a final goodbye. But there was a warning at the end of the page, in handwriting so blurred it was almost illegible. Beware, every voice demands an echo, and the echo that returns is a piece of life. At that moment, my friend, that didn't sound like a warning to my desperation. It sounded like an instruction, a solution. I closed that diary, but the idea had already taken root in my head. The next 2 days I lived in a kind of fog. Part of me, the rational part that still functioned, was screaming that this was complete madness. Old people's superstition, born from grief. But the other part, the one sick with guilt, wouldn't stop whispering. What if it works? What if it's your only chance to make things right? I clung to that second voice, justifying it to myself, saying it was just folklore, a silly ritual. What was the worst that could happen? That it wouldn't work. That I'd be standing there looking like an idiot in the middle of the desert. It was a risk I was willing to take. On the third night, I couldn't stand the anxiety anymore. I needed to do something. I opened the cardboard box again and looked for the perfect object of Diego's. It wasn't anything of economic value, of course. It was a little plastic figure, some superhero we liked when we were kids. The toy was all scratched up with a broken arm glued back on with superglue years ago. Only we understood the value of that thing. Then I took a deep breath and went to the kitchen. I took one of those small knives for cutting vegetables. My hand trembled a little when I wrapped it in a kitchen towel. I put everything in a backpack and took the car. I drove for almost an hour, leaving the city, heading toward one of those rural areas that are gradually being devoured by strip malls and housing developments. I'd found on my phone's map what seemed to be the perfect place, a forgotten dirt path that crossed with another, forming a perfect X in the middle of nowhere. When I turned off the car engine, the silence was the first thing that hit me. It was a dense, heavy silence. You couldn't hear even the sound of crickets, just the noise of gravel under my sneakers and the cold wind of early morning that made the hair on my arms stand up. I stood there for about 5 minutes next to the car, just looking at the darkness and thinking about giving up, going home and forgetting this stupidity. But the image of my brother's face, that last time, I had to try. I walked to the exact center of the crossroads. The moonlight was weak, barely illuminating the ground. I took the figure out of the backpack and placed it on the dust. Then I took the little knife. I didn't think about it much so I wouldn't chicken out. I made a quick cut on the palm of my hand. The pain was sharp, strong, and brought me back to reality for a second. I tilted my hand and let 7 or 8 drops of blood fall on the toy, staining the plastic and the earth. And then I spoke. It wasn't a spell. There were no magic words from the diary. I just talked to him there in the darkness. I asked for forgiveness. I told him everything I didn't have the courage to say that day. I told him I missed him, that the house felt too empty. And at the end, I stayed silent, my heart beating hard in my throat, looking at the dust and the drops of blood, waiting for whatever. For a while, nothing happened. The only sound was my own blood pulsing in my ears and the wind cutting through the low desert brush. I felt like a complete idiot. I took a deep breath, the taste of dust in my mouth, thinking, of course it wasn't going to work. It's just dirt, blood, and grandmother's story. I was about to pick up the figure and leave when the cold came. And it wasn't the normal cold of early morning. It was a different cold, heavy, humid, that seemed to rise from the ground itself and enter through the soles of my sneakers. The air around me became thick, as if oxygen were being sucked out. That's when I heard it, a clear, unmistakable sound, the crack of a dry branch breaking. It came from the darkness to my right, where there was nothing but open desert. I froze in place. There was no tree nearby, no tall bush that could make that noise. The sound repeated, this time a little closer, and then from the other side, behind me. They were footsteps, slow, heavy, dragging across the earth. Something was circling the crossroads, always staying at the edge of darkness. I remained paralyzed, unable to move. I could only hear that thing approaching, and then, coming from a point right in front of me, I heard another sound. It wasn't a voice. It was an inhalation, a long, deep breath with a wet sound, like it came from a lung full of mud. The echo, that was the echo the diary warned about. That's when it hit me like a ton of bricks, bringing a terror I'd never felt in my life. What the hell did I do? Desperation broke my paralysis. Without thinking, I threw myself to the ground, grabbed the blood and dirt-stained figure, and ran toward the car. I slammed the door with all my strength, and my hands were shaking so much I could barely fit the key in the ignition. The engine failed once, failed again. On the third try, it started with a loud noise. I took off, spinning wheels on the dirt road, and got out of there without looking back, with the sound of that horrible breathing resonating inside my head. I don't even remember the drive home well. I drove on autopilot with burning eyes, looking more in the rearview mirror than at the road. I arrived at my building's parking lot before dawn. I ran up the stairs, entered my house, and locked the door, the chain, everything I could. I spent the rest of that early morning curled up on the couch with all the lights on, jumping at every sound from the elevator or neighbors arriving. But when the weak, gray sunlight entered through the living room window, the terror from the night before began to seem exaggerated, distant. My mind, desperate for a logical explanation, began to work. It was stress, guilt, the suggestion from reading that diary. I was at my limit, and my head had played a dirty trick on me. It had to be that. To convince myself completely, I needed to erase the traces of my madness. I went down and washed the car inside and out. I took Diego's figure, still dirty with earth and my dried blood, my grandmother's diary, the knife. I put everything in a black garbage bag, tied tight. I drove to another neighborhood and threw it in one of those construction dumpsters. A final period. Only it didn't work. The apartment continued suffocating me. Every shadow in the corner of my eye, every creak of the wooden floor seemed like a threat. I made an impulsive decision. I threw some clothes in a suitcase, locked everything up, and hit the road again. My destination was my grandparents' old house in the interior, about 3 hours away. The house had been empty since my grandmother passed, but in my head, it was the only place in the world where I'd be safe. And for a few days, It seemed I was right. I arrived there, opened the windows to let out the musty smell, and the peace of the place embraced me. The first 3 days were blessed silence, just the sound of mockingbirds in the morning and wind swaying the trees in the yard. I slept a full night for the first time in months. I started to really believe I'd had a psychotic break, a very strong panic attack. I felt like an idiot, sure, but a relieved idiot. The nightmare had been left behind at that crossroads. I was safe. The tranquility lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, I already felt almost like a person again. I remember spending the afternoon in the yard pulling some weeds, feeling the sun on my face, and thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could finally start to heal. It was when I went into the house to drink water that I saw the first strange thing. On top of an old dresser in the living room, there was a picture frame with a photo of Diego and me when we were kids. The frame was on the floor, face down. I felt a blow to the chest. I picked up the object, looked around. It must have been the wind, I said out loud, more to convince myself than because I believed it. But all the windows in the house were closed. I put it back in place and tried not to think about it anymore. But that night, lying in bed in the absolute silence of the countryside, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of dry branches breaking. I sat up in bed immediately, cold sweat freezing my forehead. The noise was coming from the yard, right below my window. I tiptoed over there, moved the curtain aside a little, and looked outside. The moon illuminated the terrain. There was no one there, and the yard was just low grass and packed earth. There wasn't a branch or a dry leaf. The sound had no source. It was just there. The terror I felt at the crossroads returned with full force. And in the following nights, it only got worse. I started hearing whispers throughout the house. They were low, distorted, but in the middle of that white noise, I heard my name, Fernando. And the voice was a cruel, perverse imitation of Diego's voice. One night I was in the living room and heard clearly, coming from the dark hallway, "It was your fault." But the sound was hollow, and underneath I could hear that same wet breathing sound. The thing was using my pain, my memory against me. The house, my refuge, had become hell. Doors I left closed appeared open. The heavy, wet cold followed me from room to room. One night I was in the kitchen drinking a glass of water and heard footsteps, the dragging sound of leaves and dry branches. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the hallway, from inside the house, and it was getting closer. In panic, I ran to the bedroom and closed the door with the lock, pushing an old chair against the handle like in the movies. My whole body was shaking. The footsteps stopped right on the other side of the door. The silence that followed was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise. And then I heard the breathing, wet, very close, as if it had its face pressed against the wood. And a scratching, a slow, long sound of a nail or something worse scraping the door from top to bottom. There, hunched on the bedroom floor, I finally understood. The truth hit me like a concrete wall. It was no use running. It was no use throwing away the figure and the diary. The thing wasn't at the crossroads. It was never there. It was with me. The pact I made wasn't with the place. It wasn't with the objects. The pact, the echo, the debt, it was mine. And wherever I went, it would follow to collect. I don't know how long I stayed locked up on the bedroom floor. Maybe a day, maybe 2. I completely lost track. I barely ate, barely drank water from the bathroom faucet. I just stayed silent, listening, waiting for the next sound, the next scratch. Fear had transformed into something else, a paralyzing certainty that it was a matter of time before the door gave way. It was my end. It was in the middle of that lethargy of desperation that an old, almost erased memory surfaced. My grandmother, the owner of the diary, once mentioned a lady from the neighboring town, a healer who spoke with what cannot be seen. Doña Magda was a childhood memory, one of those stories you treat as folklore. But at that moment, it was all I had. I gathered the rest of the courage I had left, waited for the sun to be strong, mid-afternoon, when the presence in the house seemed weaker, more drowsy. I unlocked the door, my hand slipping on the handle from so much sweat. I left the house without looking to the sides. Every step in the yard was torture, waiting to hear the sound of dry branches behind me. I took the car and drove to the little town. I stopped at the main plaza and had to do the most humiliating thing, ask for her. "Excuse me, do you know where a lady who heals lives, who does cleansings?" I felt the looks of pity, of distrust. An old man sweeping the sidewalk of a bakery finally gave me directions to the house. It was a simple little house at the end of a cobblestone street, with a low iron gate and dozens of pots on the porch. A very old lady with completely white hair pulled back in a bun and very lively eyes opened the door. It was her. I couldn't contain myself. I broke down right there in front of her. I told her everything from beginning to end, the guilt, the diary, the crossroads, the blood, the voice imitating my brother, the scratching on the door. I expected her to laugh, to kick me out, to call me crazy. Instead, she pulled me inside with surprising strength, sat me in a wooden chair in the kitchen that smelled of fresh coffee and rue leaves, and listened to me in silence without interrupting me once. When I finished, my voice breaking, she sighed, a heavy, tired sigh. She looked me straight in the eyes and said with a firmness that didn't match her frail body, "My son, who you called, wasn't your brother. A soul of light wouldn't charge such a price. You knocked on a door you shouldn't have, and who answered you was a collector. And it's not going to leave until it takes what was promised in the pact, a piece of your life." For the first time in months, someone believed me. And the name she gave it, Collector, had a terrible sense. She told me that running was no longer useful. We had to face it. We needed to close the door I had opened. She gave me a list of things to find, a handful of coarse salt, a branch of pepper tree, rue, and a bottle of holy water from the little church in the plaza. And she sent me back to the house. "The battle," she said, "has to be on your territory." I returned to the house at sunset. Doña Magda was already there waiting for me on the porch, holding the rue and pepper tree branches. She came in with me, and with frightening calm began preparing the living room. She ordered me to close the front door, threw coarse salt in the corners of each room, closed all the windows. The air inside the house became still, heavy, electric. She looked at me, her lively eyes fixed on mine. "It's going to come with everything tonight when it feels it might lose you. You have to be strong. You have to stay in the center of the living room and call it. Be the bait." I was terrified, but I nodded. It was the only way. When night fell completely, she made a circle of salt on the wooden floor and ordered me to stay inside. She handed me an old rosary of dark wood. "Now call," she ordered in a low voice. I took a deep breath. The air didn't seem to reach my lungs. And I spoke to the emptiness of the living room, my voice no more than a thread. "I know you're here. I'm not afraid of you anymore. Show yourself." The temperature of the house plummeted in that same instant. The few light bulbs flickered and went out, leaving us in the penumbra. And in the darkest corner of the living room, a form began to coalesce. It didn't have a face. It was just a silhouette of pure darkness, a hole in reality that seemed to absorb the little light there was. And Diego's voice, now full of a hatred that wasn't his, came from that thing. "You abandoned me, Fernando. Now it's your turn to be left alone." Doña Magda began to pray, words I didn't understand, maybe Latin mixed with ancient prayers. She walked around the circle, throwing holy water in the direction of the shadow. Each drop that touched the darkness hissed like an ember in water. The creature let out a sharp scream, a sound like breaking glass, and advanced toward me, stopping violently at the salt line. It reared up, stretching to its full height. And in the last second, when Doña Magda shouted a final word, the thing extended an arm of shadow over the salt and touched me on the forehead. I felt a sharp, terrible pain inside my head, like a hot iron was tearing a piece from my brain. And then everything stopped. The light returned weak. The intense cold disappeared. The silence was total. It was over. Doña Magda helped me up from the floor. I was shaking from head to toe, but I felt light, relieved for the first time in a year. I didn't feel that weight in my chest. I closed my eyes tightly, wanting to bring up Diego's image, his smile, to finally have peace. And nothing came. I tried to remember his voice calling me to play soccer, his laughter. Silence. An absolute void where there used to be pain. I looked at the old woman, terror growing again in a different way. No, I can't remember him. His face, his voice, everything's erased. Doña Magda looked at me with enormous sadness, a compassion that hurt more than the creature's hatred. "The collector never leaves empty-handed, my son. It came looking for the piece of life you promised it, and it took the memory that made you call it in the first place. That's your penance. That's the price of your forgiveness. And this is my life now, my friend. Free from fear, from the apparition, but trapped in a different kind of hell. I did all of that for a memory, for guilt, and the price to free myself from the collector was losing the only thing that still truly connected me to my brother. I don't remember his face. I don't remember his voice. Sometimes I strain, try to search for the anger from our last fight, the sound of his laughter, anything. And I only find a hollow echo, an empty room in my mind. I only know that one day he existed, and that because of me, I lost him twice. The collector took its payment, but it left me with something worse than haunting. It left me with the knowledge that some doors, once opened, change the very shape of your soul. And some prices, once paid, can never be refunded. I live now in that space between forgetting and remembering, carrying the weight of a loss I can feel but can't recall. It's a special kind of torture, to know you've been wounded, but to have the wound erased, leaving only phantom pain in its place. Sometimes I catch myself staring at old photographs, at faces I should recognize but don't. Sometimes I wake up with tears on my face from dreams I can't remember. And sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I hear the faint echo of laughter that might have been his, but it slips away before I can grasp it. The collector kept its bargain. It took exactly what it was owed. But in the mathematics of supernatural debt, the payment always exceeds the loan. I asked for the chance to say goodbye, and it gave me eternal farewell instead. If you're listening to this and you've lost someone, really lost someone, let me tell you something. Sit with the pain. Let it burn. Let it carve its initials into your heart. Because that pain, as unbearable as it is the last pure thing you have of them. It's the proof that they mattered, that they changed you, that they were real. Don't try to take shortcuts through your grief. Don't look for mystical solutions to human problems. Don't trust voices that promise easy answers in the dark. Because some healers aren't healers at all. They're just different kinds of collectors, and they're always, always hungry. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.